Pity is weakness disguised as virtue, Nietzschean perspective. Pity, often celebrated as a moral good, is in fact a subtle enabler of weakness. This is Nietzsche's provocative stance. He argued that pity, or Mitleid, has been glorified by religious and moral institutions as a sign of compassion and righteousness. But in truth, it undermines both the person who feels it and the one it is directed toward. Rather than lifting others up, pity traps them in Jungian cycles of dependency, moral superiority, and weakness. From Nietzsche's view, when you pity someone, you are acknowledging their suffering, but not in a way that empowers them. You are implicitly placing yourself above them, declaring that their pain defines them and that they cannot overcome it without your emotional validation. In this dynamic, the person who pities gains a false sense of virtue, a moral high ground, while the pitied is reduced to their lowest state. This dynamic reinforces weakness, not strength. He draws a stark contrast between pity and strength. The Übermensch, or overman, is not someone who pities, but someone who transforms suffering into power. Nietzsche believed life inherently involves suffering, and the strongest among us are those who transmute pain into creation, growth, and will to power. Pity bypasses this process. Instead of challenging people to rise from their suffering, it locks them in it, offering comfort instead of challenge, stagnation instead of transformation. Nietzsche also saw pity as a political and religious weapon. Christianity, in particular, was suspect in his eyes for enshrining pity as a sacred virtue. In doing so, he argued, it elevated weakness and meekness over vitality, excellence, and strength. The doctrine of loving the poor and the downtrodden wasn't compassion, it was control. It was a way to tame the strong, shame the powerful, and keep the herd docile. Pity, in this sense, wasn't love, it was manipulation. Furthermore, pity has an addictive quality. It allows those who feel it to perform goodness without taking any real risk. It becomes a performance of morality, a badge of goodness that costs nothing. This leads to a culture of virtue signaling, where suffering is not alleviated but publicly acknowledged and aestheticized. The focus shifts from alleviating the root causes of suffering to displaying our awareness and emotional sensitivity to it. There is also a subtle cruelty in pity. When we pity others, we affirm their powerlessness. We do not believe they are capable of overcoming their condition. We simply react to it with soft emotion. Nietzsche would ask, is this really kindness? Or is it a way of keeping others small while appearing noble? In the end, Nietzsche's challenge is simple. Instead of pitying others, help them by becoming strong yourself. Model transformation, not empathy. Inspire strength, don't mirror weakness. Replace condescending pity with respect for resilience, and you'll uplift people not with words or feelings but with example, that is virtue without disguise. Freedom is an illusion maintained by power structures, Foucault's perspective. Freedom, as commonly understood in liberal democracies, is not a pure state of autonomy, but a managed, structured illusion. Michel Foucault argued that the very institutions that claim to enable our freedom, schools, hospitals, prisons, corporations, governments are, in fact, the mechanisms that define and constrain it. We are not free in a vacuum, we are free, within boundaries drawn by power. Power, according to Foucault, is not centralized in a king or ruling class. It is diffuse, capillary, and embedded in every relationship, every institution, every act of language. When we believe ourselves to be acting freely, choosing our path, speaking our minds, shaping our identities, we are often acting within pre-configured social, political, and cultural scripts. These scripts are not imposed violently, but subtly, through norms, habits, and expectations that we internalize. Take education, for instance. Schools claim to liberate minds through knowledge, but they also teach obedience, structure time, rank individuals, and normalize behavior. Students are not just taught facts, they are disciplined, surveilled, categorized. The same applies to prisons, which claim to reform, but instead produce a class of disciplined, regulated bodies. Even medicine, which appears neutral and scientific, exerts power by defining what is healthy, sane, or deviant. It's not just about curing disease, it's about shaping what is normal. The language of rights and freedoms becomes a mask. We are told we are free to speak, but what we can say is policed by social acceptability, algorithmic filters, and cultural codes. We are told we can choose our careers, but economic constraints, credentialism, and ideological conditioning limit real choice. We are told we are free to be ourselves, but who defines what a self is? Our gender roles, identities, and sexual expressions are all mediated through systems of discourse and control. Foucault emphasized that this is not a conspiracy. It's not that there are evil men behind curtains pulling strings. Power doesn't work like that. It doesn't need to. Power is most effective when it is invisible, when it shapes what we think is normal, natural, or inevitable. The most powerful form of control is self-regulation. You police yourself, act in your own interest, and feel free while doing exactly what society has taught you to do. The illusion of freedom is essential for modern governance. You don't need brutal force if you can cultivate a population that believes it is choosing for itself. Neoliberal societies thrive not by restricting freedom, but by redefining it in market terms: choice, consumerism, competition. But the range of acceptable choices is always controlled. You can choose Coke or Pepsi, but not the end of capitalism. Freedom, then, is not the absence of power, it is its most refined expression. And until we understand how deeply we are shaped by structures of knowledge, discourse, and discipline, we cannot even begin to talk about true freedom. Existence is a mistake driven by a blind, suffering will, Schopenhauer's perspective. Arthur Schopenhauer's worldview is among the darkest ever proposed by a major philosopher. For him, existence is not a divine gift, a cosmic journey, or a meaningful adventure. It is an error, a blunder, a curse inflicted upon us by a blind, irrational force he called the will. This will is not benevolent, conscious, or purposeful. It is a metaphysical, drivenless, insatiable, and cruel. The will, in Schopenhauer's metaphysics, underlies all of reality. It's not just the will to survive in a Darwinian sense, but a deeper principle that compels all living things to strive, to desire, to pursue goals, and to suffer endlessly in the process. Every desire, once fulfilled, gives way to another. Satisfaction is fleeting. The momentary relief of fulfilled wants is always followed by boredom, longing, or fear of loss. We are never truly content. This is not just a psychological condition, it is metaphysical. Existence itself is structured around this endless striving. Humans, because we are conscious of our condition, suffer the most. We are aware of our mortality, aware of our limitations, and constantly tormented by the gulf between what we want and what reality delivers. The very act of living is to be in conflict with the very structure of existence. Schopenhauer was not optimistic about the so-called progress of civilization. He believed that technology, wealth, and even philosophy could not save us from this metaphysical prison. The more we desire, the more we suffer. Even love, often romanticized as a peak human experience, is revealed to be a trick of the will, a mechanism to ensure reproduction. You believe you're falling in love, but it is the species using you as a pawn to perpetuate itself. Unlike later existentialists who saw meaning as something to be created, Schopenhauer saw no such redemption. The only escape was through renunciation. By negating the will through asceticism, art and compassion for fellow sufferers could temporarily transcend the torment. But these were brief respites. The condition of life itself was flawed. Art, for Schopenhauer, was a unique avenue for escape because it suspended the will. In moments of aesthetic contemplation, one could step outside of desire and simply be without wanting, striving, or grasping. Music, especially, expressed the will without concepts, allowing us to observe it safely. But this was no permanent solution. Schopenhauer's worldview is a direct assault on the optimism of Enlightenment and religious doctrines alike. He saw no salvation, no justice, no higher purpose. His philosophy is not for the faint of heart but for those who dare to look life in the eye without illusion. He offered a brutal kind of honesty. Existence, he taught, is not something to be celebrated. It is something to be endured, escaped, or negated. Morality is a tool used by the weak to shame the strong. Nietzschean perspective. Friedrich Nietzsche's critique of morality is one of the most radical in Western philosophy. He argued that what we call morality, especially Christian morality, is not a universal truth or a divine law, but a social construct developed by the weak to constrain the strong. It is not born from noble virtue, but from resentment, a deep psychological bitterness Nietzsche called ressentiment. In his view, the original morality, what he termed master morality, was forged by those who had power, confidence, health, and vitality. These individuals did not define good in opposition to evil, but rather in terms of their own excellence. To be good was to be noble, strong, courageous, truthful, and life-affirming. Evil didn't even enter their worldview. It was irrelevant to their sense of being. However, among those who lacked power, those who were sick, oppressed, envious, a new form of morality emerged: slave morality. It flipped the values of the masters on their head. What was once strength became cruelty, what was once pride became arrogance, and what was once power became oppression. Meanwhile, the qualities of the weak humility, meekness, obedience, and suffering were rebranded as good. This inversion of values wasn't a noble development, it was an act of revenge. Nietzsche saw Christianity as the ultimate expression of this slave morality. The ideal Christian is one who turns the other cheek, blesses the meek, and embraces poverty and suffering. These values, Nietzsche believed, were created by those who hated life and sought to undermine the flourishing of the strong. Rather than celebrating human excellence, they imposed guilt and shame on those who embodied it. The strong were not to be admired, but tamed. This redefinition of morality served a strategic purpose. It gave the weak a psychological advantage. They could claim the moral high ground not by achieving greatness, but by condemning it. If you couldn't rise, you could drag others down. If you couldn't build, you could curse the builders. By creating a system where suffering became sacred and ambition became suspect, the resentful imposed their will without ever having to lift a sword. Nietzsche warned that this morality, if left unchallenged, would lead to cultural decline. It would stifle creativity, breed mediocrity, and promote conformity over greatness. Societies governed by slave morality, he believed, would become stagnant, unable to produce true art, philosophy, or heroism. They would venerate victims and persecute visionaries. His remedy was the revaluation of values, the Umwertung aller Werte. He called for the creation of a new kind of human, the Übermensch, who would transcend conventional morality and create their own values rooted in life, strength, and affirmation. This individual would not be shackled by guilt or the judgment of the herd, but would live with unapologetic intensity. To Nietzsche, morality is not sacred, it is a battleground. And often the loudest voices of goodness are not those striving for virtue, but those trying to chain the extraordinary. Insanity is defined by those in power to isolate dissent, Foucauldian perspective. Michel Foucault revolutionized our understanding of madness by insisting that insanity is not simply a medical or biological reality, it is a social construct. More than that, it is a label used by institutions of power to marginalize, isolate, and silence those who deviate from the norms. Insanity is not just the absence of reason. It is often a form of rebellion that society refuses to understand. Foucault's Madness and Civilization traces the historical evolution of how Western societies have treated the mad. In the Middle Ages, the mad were often viewed with awe or reverence, seen as touched by the divine or possessing unique insight. But by the 17th century, with the rise of rationalism and the Enlightenment, madness became something to be feared, contained, and hidden. The Great Confinement swept across Europe, and thousands were locked away not just for being dangerous, but for being different. Institutions like asylums became tools of social control. They didn't just treat illness, they enforced conformity. Behaviors that challenged the prevailing order, non-normative sexualities, political rebellion, mystical experiences, or radical art were often categorized as symptoms of madness. To be mad was not merely to suffer from a disorder, but to stand outside what the dominant culture accepted as real, true, or acceptable. Foucault emphasized that madness was not discovered but produced. Psychiatry did not uncover a scientific truth about the brain, it created a new discourse, a new way of speaking about people who didn't fit in. Medical authority became the modern face of moral judgment. The mad were no longer burned or banished, they were diagnosed and medicated. The power to define who is sane and who is insane became a form of epistemic violence. Those who held the authority, doctors, judges, teachers, bureaucrats, wielded enormous influence over lives, often with little transparency or accountability. A woman expressing rage at her domestic confinement could be labeled hysterical. A man questioning political authority could be deemed paranoid. Creative visionaries like Van Gogh or Antonin Artaud were institutionalized not because they were dangerous, but because they unsettled society. This raises a disturbing question. How much of what we call insanity is actually dissent that threatens the status quo? Foucault did not argue that all mental illness is fake. Rather, he warned that the line between madness and nonconformity is often drawn by power. What one society sees as pathological, another may view as sacred or visionary. The mad are not always sick. Sometimes, they are just inconvenient. Understanding insanity in this light shifts our attention from the brain to society, from medicine to politics. The question is no longer, what's wrong with this person, but who decides what is normal and why? Foucault's work continues to challenge us to see how institutions disguise repression as care, and how sanity itself may be a form of control. Human desire is a cruel, endless cycle of need and disappointment. Schopenhauerian perspective. Arthur Schopenhauer's philosophy centers on one central, haunting premise. Human desire is not a gateway to joy, but the very engine of our suffering. Far from being a positive force, desire is a trapa, perpetual hunger that can never be satisfied. It is a cycle of need, fulfillment, and emptiness that defines the tragic nature of existence itself. Desire begins as lack. We feel incomplete, restless, or unsatisfied. This condition motivates action. We seek food, sex, love, status, security. Once we achieve what we want, there is a brief moment of relief. But that relief is not joy, it is simply the cessation of pain. Soon, boredom creeps in. Or worse, we fear losing what we've gained. New desires emerge. The cycle restarts. Schopenhauer believed that this pattern is universal. It applies to the rich and the poor, the powerful and the weak. Even the most successful individuals are not exempt. In fact, those with more means may suffer more because they run out of distractions. The pursuit of happiness, he claimed, is ultimately an illusion. We are not made to be happy, we are made to want. This endless willing is not just psychological, it is metaphysical. Schopenhauer's will is the driving force of all life. It is blind, directionless, and insatiable. The will wants for no reason other than to want. It manifests through us, and we are its slaves. Our consciousness may believe it is in control, but in truth, it is just the servant of this deeper, unconscious force. Even love, which many consider the highest human experience, is for Schopenhauer merely a trick of the will. We are biologically manipulated into desiring partners not for personal fulfillment, but for reproductive success. We believe we've found our soulmate, but in truth, we are being used by nature to produce offspring with optimal traits. Art, philosophy, and asceticism offer fleeting escapes. In moments of profound aesthetic experience, we can detach from the will and exist without striving. But these moments are temporary. The will always returns. The hunger always returns. Schopenhauer believed that the best life is one that negates desire as much as possible. This doesn't mean he advocated for suicide or nihilism. Instead, he admired saints, monks, and artists who turned away from the world's noise. By denying the will-be, refusing to participate in the endless pursuit, they found a deeper peace. In a world obsessed with ambition, self-improvement, and gratification, Schopenhauer's view is a powerful antidote. It asks us to examine whether our desires serve us or enslave us. Because in the end, desire is not fulfillment waiting to happen. It is suffering waiting to repeat. There is no absolute truth, only perspectives reinforced by control. Foucauldian perspective. Michel Foucault dismantled the comfortable Enlightenment belief that truth is something objective, eternal, and waiting to be discovered. For Foucault, truth is not found, it is made. It does not exist outside of human relationships, but is produced within webs of power and discourse. Truth, he argued, is inseparable from the mechanisms that define, authorize, and enforce it. It is not free. Floating it is institutional. What we call truth is a construct born from language, social structures, academic systems, and political necessity. Every era has had its own truths: divine right of kings, geocentrism, racial hierarchies, heteronormativity. These were not just opinions, they were established, taught, and enforced by the church, the state, the university, and the media. They were the truths of their time, and anyone who challenged them was branded a heretic, lunatic, or criminal. Foucault emphasized that truth is bound up with what he called regimes of truth systems that determine what can be said, who can say it, and what counts as legitimate knowledge. Scientists, priests, teachers, doctors, and judges are not neutral arbiters of truth. They are agents of a structure that defines truth in ways that serve dominant interests. Whether it's psychiatric diagnosis, sexual norms, criminal behavior, or medical definitions of gender, truth is often what reinforces the existing order. Consider how truth is handled in modern politics. Two sides present incompatible narratives, both claiming to be rooted in facts, evidence, or morality. Each builds a world of truth sustained by media, institutions, and repetition. The side with greater control over education, law, or information flows ultimately shapes what the public accepts as true. Foucault would argue this is not a breakdown of truth, but its true nature revealed. Control over truth production is power at its most sophisticated. Unlike brute force, which compels the body, truth shapes the soul. If you control what people believe is normal, rational, or factual, you don't need to coerce them, they will regulate themselves. This is the heart of Foucault's idea of biopower. Systems that manage life by shaping knowledge, desire, and identity. We believe we are choosing freely, but our choices have already been filtered by what we've been told is real. This doesn't mean all knowledge is equally false, or that nothing matters. Foucault's point is not to deny facts, but to interrogate how facts are produced and used. What questions are allowed to be asked? Who is funded to study them? Which findings are amplified or suppressed? Truth, like money or language, is a social product. It circulates, gains value, and legitimizes action. In this light, truth is a battlefield. Competing powers struggle to define what counts as real. Every book, broadcast, curriculum, or public health policy is a skirmish in the war over reality. Understanding this doesn't make truth worthless, it makes it political. And once you understand that truth is never neutral, you begin to see the world not as it is, but as it is made to be. God is dead, and we killed him out of our mediocrity. Nietzschean perspective. God is dead. This statement, perhaps Nietzsche's most famous, is often misunderstood. He didn't mean it literally. He meant that the belief in Gottes, the moral center, as the giver of meaning, as the source of objective values no longer held power over Western civilization. And we didn't lose God through war or persecution. We killed him not in a heroic act of rebellion, but in a slow, cowardly erosion of faith, depth, and courage. We let him die out of mediocrity. Nietzsche believed that the death of God was inevitable once science, reason, and secularism became dominant. For centuries, Western thought had rested on the assumption that morality came from a divine source. With that foundation gone, the moral architecture remained standing, but it was hollow. People still spoke of good and evil, right and wrong, but with no transcendent source. These became habits, not truths. But Nietzsche's warning was not about atheism, it was about the consequences. Killing God meant killing absolute meaning, killing objective morality, killing the belief in a universal human purpose. And we were not ready for that freedom. In The Gay Science, he writes of the madman who runs through the town declaring that God is dead and we have killed him. The madman asks, "How will we comfort ourselves? Who will wipe this blood from our hands?" The mediocrity Nietzsche refers to is the herd mentality, the modern individual who is content with shallow pleasures, moral conformity, and safe opinions. Instead of seizing the opportunity to create new values, to become the Übermensch, the overman who shapes meaning from within, we retreated. We clung to decayed moral systems, turned to nationalism, consumerism, or nihilism to fill the void. We killed God but lacked the courage to live without him. Nietzsche feared the rise of the last man, a creature who avoids suffering, avoids passion, avoids greatness. The last man says, "We have invented happiness," and blinks. He wants comfort, not challenge. He is the spiritual consequence of a world without God, mediocre, satisfied, and spiritually empty. This is the true tragedy. God died not in a blaze of rebellious glory, but through boredom and disinterest, through the elevation of safety over risk, sentiment over greatness, and ease over effort. The death of God is not just a loss of theology, it is the loss of transcendence, of striving, of soul. Nietzsche was not cheering the death of God, he was mourning it. But he also saw it as an opportunity. If we cannot rely on a divine source, then the responsibility of meaning-making falls squarely on our shoulders. The question is whether we are strong enough to bear that burden or whether we will collapse into nihilism, forever haunted by the corpse we created. The will to live is the root of all suffering, Schopenhauerian perspective. For Arthur Schopenhauer, the fundamental force behind all life is the will-a-blind, unconscious, striving energy that permeates everything in existence. Unlike other philosophers who saw will as a virtue or a source of human strength, Schopenhauer viewed it as a curse. The will to live is not noble, it is the origin of every agony we endure. The will is not rational. It is not directed toward higher goals. It simply wants for no reason and to no end. In humans, this manifests as desire. The desire for food, love, status, security, pleasure, even meaning. These desires give rise to actions, ambitions, and relationships. But they never result in lasting satisfaction. The moment a desire is fulfilled, it is replaced by another. We escape pain only briefly, before falling into boredom or renewed longing. This cycle is relentless. To live is to want, and to want is to suffer. Schopenhauer argued that suffering is not an occasional feature of life, it is its foundation. Pain is constant, pleasure is fleeting. Even joy is usually the absence of suffering rather than a positive state. We chase happiness like a mirage, never realizing that it's the will that keeps us trapped in pursuit. Unlike other thinkers who saw human reason as our saving grace, Schopenhauer believed reason only made things worse. Animals suffer, but they do not understand their suffering. Humans, endowed with self-awareness, suffer more because we can imagine other outcomes, feel regret, anticipate death, and perceive our powerlessness. Consciousness, far from liberating us, deepens the wound. Love, often idealized as a redemptive force, is especially insidious in Schopenhauer's framework. It is a tool of the will to reproduce. You think you're falling in love based on personality or virtue, but beneath that lies the will's biological imperative. You are not choosing freely, you are being used by life's machinery to create more life, and therefore, more suffering. Even heroic efforts achieving great success, producing art, or founding families are not exempt. They are simply higher expressions of the will, still bound by it. Every act of striving is still ensnared in the endless chain of wanting and lacking. Greatness does not escape, the will it intensifies it. So what is the way out? Schopenhauer's answer lies in denial not of life, but of the will. Through asceticism, meditation, deep aesthetic experience, and compassion for others' suffering, one can achieve a degree of detachment. The saints, monks, and mystics are not foolish, they are enlightened. They see the trap and choose silence, renunciation, and stillness. But these are rare paths. Most people will never break the chain. They will suffer, breed, and die caught in the gears of the will that birthed them. Schopenhauer offers no shallow hope. His philosophy is a mirror held up to the human condition, and in that mirror we see the raw truth. We are not noble beings fallen from grace. We are creatures of hunger, led blindly by a force that does not care. Sexuality is shaped by institutions more than by nature, Foucauldian perspective. Michel Foucault turned the study of sexuality on its head. While the common belief was that sexuality is a natural, biological instinct repressed by society, Foucault claimed the opposite. Sexuality, as we understand it, is not a natural force waiting to be expressed. It is a construct, shaped, molded, and defined by institutions. Far from being repressed, sexuality has been produced by power structures in order to regulate populations, manage bodies, and control identities. Historically, sexuality was not even seen as a personal identity. In ancient times, acts were judged, not people. A man could engage in same-sex acts without being labeled homosexual. It wasn't the behavior that defined a person's essence, it was the context, power dynamics, and social status. It wasn't until the 19th century that the modern idea of sexuality as a deep-seated identity emerged, and it wasn't science that discovered it. It was institutions, medical, legal, religious, who created categories, pathologies, and norms. The rise of medicine and psychiatry gave birth to terms like homosexual, pervert, nymphomaniac, and frigidity. These weren't merely descriptive, they were regulatory. By labeling certain desires as deviant or abnormal, institutions gained the authority to diagnose, isolate, or treat people who did not conform. The invention of these sexual categories allowed society to surveil, normalize, and discipline individuals under the guise of care or protection. Foucault argued that the proliferation of discourse around sex in the modern era is not evidence of liberation, but of control. The more we talk about sex in therapy, in education, in media, the more power exerts itself over our bodies. Sex is no longer private. It is scrutinized, measured, classified. We are encouraged to confess our desires, expose our histories, and define ourselves by our preferences. But all of this is part of a deeper mechanism of surveillance. Even liberated expressions of sexuality are not free from institutional influence. LGBTQ identities, while vital for political recognition and protection, are still shaped within the same grid of intelligibility made visible and understandable through state systems, media representations, and legal frameworks. They are validated only to the extent that they can be named, categorized, and managed. Gender, too, is deeply entangled in this structure. The binary of male-female is not a purely natural fact. It's a social framework reinforced by institutions like schools, families, and governments. From birth, individuals are slotted into roles with expectations about dress, behavior, attraction, and reproduction. Deviations are often punished, pathologized, or marginalized, not by nature, but by institutional force. This does not mean that desire is fake, or that biology plays no role. Foucault's point is that what counts as normal or perverse, healthy or sick, is not dictated by nature, is negotiated through power. Sexuality, then, is not a universal constant. It is a mirror that reflects the values, anxieties, and agendas of the societies that shape it. Understanding this empowers us to question not just how we desire, but why we desire in the ways we do, and who benefits from those patterns. Democracy is herd mentality glorified, Nietzschean perspective. Friedrich Nietzsche viewed democracy not as the pinnacle of human political development, but as the ultimate triumph of mediocrity. To him, democracy was not a system that empowered the individual, but one that elevated the collective at the expense of greatness. It was the institutionalization of the herd instinct, the tendency of people to conform, obey, and suppress anything that challenged the norm. In a democratic society, everyone has a voice, and every opinion is treated as equal. On the surface, this seems fair. But Nietzsche asked a radical question: what if not all opinions are equal? What if truth, wisdom, and excellence are not democratically distributed? By treating the voice of the wise as no more valuable than the voice of the ignorant, democracy levels the playing field not upwards, but downwards. He believed that democracy emerged from the same resentful impulse that fueled Christian morality, deep hatred of distinction, power, and brilliance. The masses, unable to rise to the level of the exceptional, sought instead to pull the exceptional down. They disguised their resentment in the language of equality, rights, and justice. But beneath the surface lay a fear of difference and a need for conformity. In democratic societies, charisma often replaces competence. The crowd does not seek wisdom, it seeks affirmation. Leaders are not chosen for their insight or strength, but for their ability to reflect the desires of the many. Popularity replaces truth, sensation replaces depth. Politics becomes theater, not governance. Nietzsche feared that in such a culture, the truly great individuals, the philosophers, artists, inventors, and rebels would be silenced or ignored. Their views would be too dangerous, too elitist, too unsettling. The herd wants comfort, not challenge. It wants security, not freedom. It wants to be ruled, not awakened. Education in democratic societies, too, often serves the herd. It promotes consensus, obedience, and utilitarian goals. Children are not taught to think dangerously or create new values. They are trained to pass tests, follow rules, and respect majority opinion. The system does not breed Übermenschen, it breeds conformity. Nietzsche's critique is not just political, it is spiritual. He believed democracy numbs the human spirit by removing the possibility of transcendence. When everyone is equal, no one dares to rise. When all values are negotiated through majority approval, none can be truly radical. Democracy thus becomes the triumph of safety over greatness. But Nietzsche was not advocating for tyranny or aristocracy in the traditional sense. He wanted a culture where individuals could will their own values, not one where they were crushed by the mob. His enemy was not the system per se, but the spirit it bred, timid, envious, and comfortable in mediocrity. Democracy, to Nietzsche, is not freedom. It is the crowd's self-congratulation. And until we confront the fear of greatness that hides beneath its surface, we remain its prisoners. Individual identity is a fabrication produced by power relations, Foucauldian perspective. The belief in a stable, unified self is one of the most pervasive ideas in modern society. We are told that we have an inner essence and identity that defines who we are, what we want, and how we should live. But Michel Foucault challenged this assumption at its core. He argued that the idea of the individual is not natural or eternal. It is a social construct, produced and regulated by systems of power. From the moment we are born, we are inscribed with labels: name, gender, nationality, race, religion. These are not chosen freely, they are assigned. As we grow, institutions like schools, hospitals, families, and media tell us what it means to be a man or woman, a good citizen, a healthy person, a normal mind. Identity is not discovered, it is imposed. Foucault emphasized that these identities serve specific political functions. They allow society to manage people, categorize them, and apply rules. A government cannot govern masses of undifferentiated individual needs types. The criminal, the student, the worker, the patient, these are identities created through discourse and reinforced through surveillance, law, and education. Take, for example, sexuality. Before the 19th century, people engaged in various sexual behaviors, but were not defined by them. There were no homosexuals or heterosexuals in the modern sense. But with the rise of psychiatry and criminology, new categories emerged. These were not just descriptive, they became prescriptive. People were taught to see themselves as something that needed to be understood, managed, or corrected. Even the rebellious identities like the criminal, the deviant, the madare, shaped by the very systems they resist, institutions define the margins of acceptability, and in doing so, define the outsider. Power doesn't just suppress, it produces. It creates the language through which people understand themselves, even in opposition. Foucault did not mean that people are fake or that identity is meaningless. Rather, he urged us to see how deeply embedded our sense of self is within systems of control. What we take as personal truth may in fact be the echo of institutional voices. We think we are choosing freely, but our options were scripted long before we arrived. This has profound implications. If identity is produced, it can be challenged, reshaped, or rejected. We are not locked into roles. But that requires awareness of how we've been formed. It requires questioning not just society, but our most intimate assumptions. Who are you when you are not being watched? Who would you be if no one ever told you what you should be? Foucault believed liberation begins not with asserting identity, but with destabilizing it. Only then can we begin to live beyond the identities power has crafted for use and explore what it means to be free, even in a world designed to define us. Compassion often masks resentment, Nietzschean perspective. Compassion is almost universally praised as a moral good, a selfless act of care, empathy, and love. But Friedrich Nietzsche warned us to look deeper. What if compassion, in many cases, is not genuine kindness, but a subtle, disguised form of resentment? What if the person expressing compassion is not elevating another, but quietly relishing their suffering, affirming their own superiority in the process? Nietzsche called this hidden dynamic resentment, a complex mix of envy, inferiority, and moral inversion. According to him, when those who feel powerless encounter strength, talent, or success they cannot match, they often do not confront it directly. Instead, they invert values. They declare weakness to be virtue, humility to be nobility, and suffering to be sacred. Compassion becomes the language of this inversion. When someone says, "I feel so sorry for you," it can be genuine. But it can also be a subtle assertion of dominance. The one who pities takes the superior moral role. The one who is pitied is locked into the role of the inferior, the broken, the victim, the one in need of saving. Compassion, in this sense, becomes a method of control. It positions the sufferer as incapable of self-transcendence and elevates the one who feels for them. This is especially true in social and political contexts. Entire movements can be fueled by a performative compassion that is actually resentment wearing a mask. Those who cannot create, who cannot lead, who cannot bear the greatness of others, instead claim moral superiority through empathy. "We care" becomes a war cry. They seek not to empower, but to equalize by shaming, silencing, or humiliating those who dare to rise above. Nietzsche argued that true compassion should arise from strength, not weakness. The noble individual might show care for others, but never in a way that disempowers them or makes them small. Real compassion is dangerous. It challenges people to rise, to suffer meaningfully, to confront hardship with dignity. The false compassion of resentment, by contrast, keeps others weak, passive, and dependent. It whispers, "You are hurt, and you will always be hurt." let me feel better than you by helping you. This is most evident in how society treats success and failure. When someone falls, the crowd rushes in not just to help, but to judge. Public compassion can become a form of social punishment. We see this in media spectacles, cancel culture, and moral outcries that seem less about justice and more about symbolic victory. Pity becomes a weapon. The compassionate crowd is often the most ruthless. Nietzsche's insight was not to demonize compassion, but to warn us. When compassion is used to mask resentment, it becomes poison. It stops growth. It replaces the will to overcome with the comfort of victimhood. And worst of all, it allows the weak to dominate the strong under the banner of morality. To truly help others, we must not indulge in pity, but inspire in them the will to power the courage to face suffering with their own strength, not ours. Truth is manufactured, not discovered. Foucauldian perspective. The Enlightenment taught us that truth is out there, waiting to be discovered through reason, science, and empirical inquiry. But Michel Foucault argued that this is a comforting illusion. Truth, he claimed, is not something that exists independently of power. It is not an objective substance waiting to be unearthed. Instead, truth is manufactured, is produced through systems of discourse, shaped by historical forces, and reinforced by the mechanisms of control. Truth, in this sense, is not eternal. It changes over time, not because we get closer to reality, but because the dominant powers shift. What was once heresy becomes science. What was once common sense becomes madness. Institutions, governments, churches, universities, mediato not merely report truth, they create the frameworks within which truth becomes possible. These are what Foucault called regimes of truth. Each regime has its own rules about what can be said, who can speak, and what counts as evidence. A truth in one era, say, the divine right of kingship, replaced by another, say, the sovereignty of the people. But both truths are rooted not in objective discovery, but in political and cultural structures that serve particular interests. Truth is always embedded in power. Take medicine as an example. We often think of medical knowledge as neutral and scientific. But Foucault showed how psychiatry, for instance, created entire categories of mental illness, not just to describe, but to discipline. Homosexuality was pathologized. Female hysteria was invented. These were not facts waiting to be found. They were constructs that gave institutions the power to manage bodies and behavior. Similarly, legal systems define crime, but they also define what counts as truth in a courtroom. What evidence is admissible? Whose testimony is valid? Truth here is not found, it is performed. And those who control the rules of the performance control what the audience believes. Even science is not immune. Funding, institutional priorities, peer review, and cultural values shape what questions get asked, which hypotheses are tested, and which findings are accepted. The image of the lone scientist discovering a timeless truth is a myth. Science, like all human endeavors, operates within a network of influence, ideology, and negotiation. This doesn't mean all truths are lies, or that nothing is real. Foucault wasn't advocating for relativism. He was urging us to see that every truth is a product and that its creation benefits someone. Truth is strategic. It enables action, justifies authority, and disciplines dissent. To ask, what is true, is to ask, whose truth is this? Who does it serve? Who does it silence? To Foucault, freedom begins with recognizing that truth is not neutral. It is a battleground. And if we want to live authentically, we must not only seek truth, we must learn to question the conditions that make it possible. Those who preach virtue most loudly are often the most corrupt. Nietzschean insight. Nietzsche held a deep suspicion of those who wore virtue on their sleeves. In his eyes, the loudest moralizers, those who constantly talk about justice, compassion, goodness, and truth are often the very ones who are hiding their own decay. Their moral fervor, he believed, is rarely a reflection of inner strength. Instead, it is a mask, a diversion, or a strategy. The louder they preach, the more they betray what they are trying to conceal. This insight is not just psychological, it's philosophical. Nietzsche saw morality not as a universal truth, but as a social construct often built on resentment. Those who lack strength, beauty, or power often invent moral systems that condemn those who possess these qualities. The weak cannot confront the strong directly, so they declare strength to be evil and weakness to be virtue. They create systems where humility, submission, and obedience are praised not because these are good, but because they are attainable. This is the essence of slave morality. The virtuous man becomes one who suffers silently, who turns the other cheek, who denies his passions. But Nietzsche saw this as a form of corruptione, denial of life itself. The true virtues, in his view, are courage, vitality, creativity, and strength. These virtues do not need to be announced, they are lived. So, why do the corrupt preach virtue? Because moral performance grants power. When you loudly declare yourself righteous, you put others on the defensive. You gain the upper hand in social and political arenas. This is evident in religious leaders, politicians, celebrities, and activists who build entire identities around goodness only to be later revealed as hypocrites, abusers, or tyrants. The virtue was never the point. The performance was. There is also a psychological payoff. Those who feel ashamed, inadequate, or morally hollow often compensate by preaching loudly to others. It externalizes their internal conflict. By attacking others for being immoral, they distract from their own failings. By aligning themselves with the good, they avoid self-examination. In this way, morality becomes less about ethics and more about image. Nietzsche's critique extends to institutions as well. Churches that speak of love while hoarding wealth, governments that declare peace while funding wars, corporations that adopt social justice slogans while exploiting labor. The louder the virtue signal, the more it should be scrutinized. This isn't a call to abandon morality, but to practice it quietly, personally, and authentically. The truly virtuous don't shout. They don't demand applause. They live in alignment with their values, without needing to convert or condemn others. They don't need moral theater because they have moral substance. Nietzsche's warning is clear. Beware of those who moralize too loudly. They are often not guardians of virtue, but predators cloaked in it. Look at their actions, not their words. Examine the effects of their values, not the volume of their sermons. True integrity whispers only, hypocrisy needs a megaphone. Civilization is a cage gilded in illusions. Schopenhauerian Nietzschean synthesis. Civilization, often regarded as the apex of human achievement, is in truth a gilded cage, elegant on the outside, but designed to contain, conform, and condition its inhabitants. Beneath its polished surface lies a system of psychological domestication, where instincts are tamed, rebellion is pathologized, and the human animal is reshaped to fit into artificial patterns of control. What we call progress is often the suppression of primal authenticity. Arthur Schopenhauer saw civilization as a mask, a veil draped over the brutal reality of the world. Life, in his view, is suffering driven by the endless will to live, and civilization is one of its cleverest coping mechanisms. It distracts us from the fundamental agony of existence by offering illusions, art, religion, etiquette, achievement. We trade wildness for ritual, freedom for comfort, meaninglessness for ceremony. Friedrich Nietzsche took this further. He saw civilization not just as a distraction, but as a form of spiritual decay. In its quest to regulate behavior and maintain order, civilization suppresses the will to power the core drive in humans to assert, create, and overcome. Institutions enforce conformity under the guise of morality. The herd is praised, while the exceptional individual is feared, mocked, or destroyed. Civilization, for Nietzsche, is where greatness goes to die. Modern life illustrates this thesis vividly. We are surrounded by illusions of choice, but most of our actions are dictated by invisible systems, economic, legal, technological, educational. We live in cities, but rarely touch nature. We are connected by digital networks, but increasingly isolated. Civilization has given us tools and toys, but taken from us silence, purpose, and instinctual clarity. Social norms are among the most powerful cages. From a young age, we are taught what is acceptable, how to dress, how to speak, how to desire. Those who deviate are punished, not always violently, but through exclusion and ridicule. The dream of civilization is that all people become interchangeable, predictable, manageable. But this dream is also a nightmare, flattening of the human spirit into compliance. The gilding of this cage comes through language and ideology. We are told that civilization is rational, humane, and enlightened. But its foundations are often built on conquest, oppression, and exploitation. Prisons, surveillance, propaganda, and war are all products of civilization. The cage is real, but it is decorated with rhetoric about liberty and order. We believe we are free because we are allowed to move within the bars. Art and culture offer temporary escapes. Music, philosophy, and literature can awaken something primal, remind us of the life that lies beyond the cage. But even these are often co-opted, commodified, sanitized, packaged. The system knows how to make rebellion into fashion, resistance into entertainment. Nothing is sacred for long. To recognize civilization as a cage is not to reject all its fruits. Rather, it is to remain vigilanto, avoid mistaking comfort for freedom, structure for meaning, illusion for truth. The cage may be gilded, but it is still a cage, and only those who see it for what it is can ever hope to break its bars. Power is not possessed, it circulates and always oppresses. Foucauldian perspective. Michel Foucault dismantled the classical notion of power as something held by kings, governments, or institutions like a sword or a currency. Instead, he proposed a far more complex and insidious model. Power is not possessed, it circulates. It flows through relationships, language, architecture, knowledge, and discipline. It is not something you have, but something you exercise often unconsciously, often in the name of truth, safety, or care. This reconceptualization has profound implications. If power is everywhere, then resistance is also everywhere. But so too is oppression. Power does not need a tyrant to be oppressive. It can emerge from systems designed to protect. Hospitals, schools, and prisons all claim noble purposes, but they are also sites of surveillance, normalization, and coercion. Power in modern society does not shout. It whispers, trains, and expects. In this model, power produces reality. It doesn't just repress behavior, it creates categories of identity, establishes what is true, and defines what is thinkable. When psychiatry classifies someone as schizophrenic, it is not merely discovering a condition, it is producing a way of being that then justifies intervention. When education defines intelligence, it shapes futures. When media defines beauty, it disciplines bodies. Power is not top-down. It moves laterally, through peer pressure, habits, self-monitoring. Foucault used the metaphor of the panopticon prison designed so that inmates never know when they're being watched, and therefore internalize discipline. This is how power works best. When people begin to police themselves, when conformity is voluntary, when oppression feels like freedom. We experience this in everyday life. Social norms dictate how we speak, dress, and behave. Algorithms shape what we see and think. Even well-meaning conversations about diversity, inclusion, or safety can become instruments of soft control defining who gets to speak, how we define harm, and what emotions are valid. Power always adapts. It does not disappear when old hierarchies collapse. It mutates into new forms. Importantly, power is relational. It exists in the dynamic between doctor and patient, teacher and student, parent and child. These roles are not evil in themselves, but they carry with them expectations, authority, and discipline. We may love the people in power over us, but that does not erase the asymmetry. And we may wield power without realizing it by judging, excluding, or labeling others. Foucault's insight was that the most dangerous power is the one we don't see. It hides in bureaucracy, in medical charts, in legal codes, in data sets. It operates not through violence, but through categorization, silence, and normalization. And because it flows everywhere, no one is innocent. We are all implicated. We are all both victims and agents. To understand that power circulates is to recognize that freedom is never guaranteed. It must be constantly interrogated, questioned, and reclaimed. Because wherever power flows unchecked, oppression, however polite, however invisible, will always follow. Love is a trick played by the species to propagate itself. Schopenhauerian perspective. Arthur Schopenhauer, ever the pessimist, viewed love not as a transcendent connection between souls, but as a cunning deception played by nature the species on the individual. Love, in his stark metaphysical framework, is not about happiness, companionship, or emotional depth. It is about reproduction. It is the will to life, expressing itself through illusion, drawing individuals into bondage for the sole purpose of creating more life, and thus, more suffering. To understand this fully, one must grasp Schopenhauer's concept of the will. The will is an irrational, blind force that underlies all existence. It drives everything: movement, desire, creation, not for any noble end, but because it must. In humans, the will manifests most potently in sexual desire. But nature cannot rely on pure physical urges alone. It needs to ensnare us deeper. So it invents love, an elaborate romantic narrative that masks the brutal biological agenda beneath. When we fall in love, Schopenhauer argued, we are not actually choosing our partner freely. We are being manipulated, drawn towards someone whose genes complement our own, whose body and temperament will help create fitter offspring. The illusion of personal happiness is nature's way of ensuring the species continues. You think you've found your soulmate, but really, you've been drafted into a reproductive mission. This explains why love is so intense, irrational, and overpowering. It hijacks logic. People abandon careers, families, or religions in its name. They suffer, obsess, and even kill. And yet, when the biological mission is complete, when the child is born, or the partner secured, the passion often fades, the spell breaks. The individual is left with the consequences, while the species has achieved its goal. Love also brings profound suffering. It is filled with longing, jealousy, insecurity, and fear. We idealize the beloved, project fantasies onto them, and then despair when they do not live up to the illusion. For Schopenhauer, this suffering is not incidental, it is essential. The species must create a strong enough illusion to override reason, and suffering is part of the fuel. Even worse, love does not care for individual well-being. A person may fall in love with someone wholly incompatible, even destructive, because nature doesn't care about your happiness, it cares about your reproductive chemistry. This is why tragic love stories feel so powerful. The individual suffers, but the species triumphs. From this view, marriage is not a sanctuary but a trap. It binds individuals in legal and moral obligation after the will has completed its mission. What remains is often boredom, conflict, or quiet resentment. And yet the system persists, because nature needs it to. This is not to say that emotional bonds, loyalty, or kindness are impossible, but they are built on top of a biological foundation that is fundamentally deceptive. Love is not a lie, but it is a mask. And behind that mask is the will, indifferent to your dreams, but deeply invested in your surrender. The pursuit of happiness is self-deception. Schopenhauerian perspective. The modern world has enshrined the pursuit of happiness as a fundamental right and purpose of life. Governments promise it, corporations market it, and self-help industries profit from it. But Arthur Schopenhauer would look upon this obsession and call it a grand delusion. In his eyes, the pursuit of happiness is not a noble endeavor, it is self-deception. We chase what cannot be sustained, define happiness in terms we don't understand, and suffer more in its pursuit than we would in its absence. For Schopenhauer, human life is governed by the will, a blind, irrational drive that pushes us to survive, reproduce, and strive. This will is never satisfied. When one desire is fulfilled, another immediately takes its place. Temporary pleasure is quickly replaced by boredom or new longing. There is no final state of rest, only a ceaseless pendulum swinging between need and fleeting satisfaction. To pursue happiness, then, is to chase a miragione that constantly recedes the closer we approach it. This endless striving creates a life filled with restlessness. People set goals, believing happiness lies just beyond them. The perfect job, the ideal relationship, financial success, spiritual enlightenment. But even when these are attained, the emotional high fades. The mind adjusts, expectations rise, and new goals emerge. We tell ourselves we're progressing, but we're running on a treadmill. The illusion is that happiness is an endpoint. The reality is that it's a chemical flicker in a storm of dissatisfaction. Schopenhauer also pointed out that true peace comes not from desire but from its absence. The happiest moments in life are often when we forget ourselves, lost in music, immersed in nature, or absorbed in art. These are not times when we pursue happiness, but when we escape the tyranny of wanting. In such moments, the will is silenced, and we simply are. This is not happiness in the traditional sense, is a cessation of suffering. The pursuit of happiness is also social in nature. We compare ourselves to others, adopt external measures of success, and believe we are failing if we don't feel joy all the time. This adds layers of guilt and inadequacy to the already impossible task. We don't just suffer, we suffer because we're not happy. We chase an emotion, fail to maintain it, and then blame ourselves for its absence. In Schopenhauer's view, the wiser path is not to pursue happiness, but to understand suffering, to recognize that life is not about maximizing pleasure, but minimizing pain. This doesn't mean embracing misery, but cultivating detachment, letting go of desire, practicing moderation, and finding tranquility in the present moment. Contentment, not happiness, becomes the more realistic and honest goal. The pursuit of happiness is not evil, but it is often naive. It promises a paradise that never arrives. Schopenhauer urges us to wake from this dream, not to become nihilists, but to become realists. The path to peace is not through indulgence or ambition, it is through understanding the futility of endless wanting. Slavery never disappeared, it simply changed form, Foucauldian perspective. Slavery, as it was historically known, chattel slavery, plantation slavery, the forced ownership of one human by another, has officially been abolished. Yet Michel Foucault and other critical theorists would argue that its essence persists. Slavery never truly vanished. It evolved, adapted, and disguised itself. The chains are no longer made of iron, but of contracts, economic dependency, surveillance, and social systems. Modern institutions don't need to whip bodies, they condition minds. Foucault's theory of power suggests that control in modern society doesn't require overt violence. It operates through discipline, normalization, and bureaucracy. Modern workers, for instance, are free in name, but many are locked into exploitative labor systems where leaving means starvation or homelessness. They must sell their time, their attention, their physical energy, not for freedom, but for survival. This is not legal slavery, but it is spiritual bondage. The corporate system exemplifies this. Employees clock in and out, follow dress codes, suppress dissent, and compete in productivity metrics. Surveillance is digital mail monitoring, keystroke tracking, biometric attendance. Discipline is psychological performance reviews, reputation scores, and fear of being replaced by someone more obedient. People become compliant not because they are forced to, but because they are conditioned to. This is Foucault's genius, understanding how power becomes internalized. Debt is another form of modern enslavement. Students, workers, and families take on loans that bind them to banks and creditors for decades. Technically, they signed contracts voluntarily. But structurally, they had no real choice. Education, housing, and healthcare are priced out of reach, so people sign away their futures to access basic stability. Their labor does not enrich them, it feeds systems they do not control. Even prisons, supposedly about justice, reveal the persistence of slavery. The prison industrial complex in many countries uses inmates as forced labor under the guise of rehabilitation. They make furniture, clothes, and military equipment for pennies, if anything. The 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, for example, abolished slavery except as punishment for a crime. Inmates remain some of the only people legally stripped of bodily autonomy and forced to work. Beyond economic systems, there are also cultural forms of enslavement. Beauty standards, gender roles, and social norms dictate how people should live, look, and behave. Those who deviate are punished with exclusion, mockery, or institutional penalties. This is not slavery by the whippet, slavery by expectation. What's insidious is that modern slavery is largely invisible. It presents itself as freedom. You chose this job. You signed that lease. You broke the law. But the structures that shape those choices remain opaque and unaccountable. Freedom has been redefined as compliance, and autonomy is narrowed to picking between options crafted by someone else. Slavery persists not because people are evil, but because systems evolve to preserve control. Foucault would urge us to look not at the surface of society, but beneath it the rituals, language, and institutions that maintain domination under new names. To liberate ourselves, we must first recognize how thoroughly we've been trained to call our cages freedom. Religion is a narcotic for the resentful, Nietzschean perspective. Friedrich Nietzsche's critique of religion was not simply that it was false but that it was sick. He believed religion, particularly Christianity, was a psychological mechanism created by the weak to soothe their pain, rationalize their impotence, and exact symbolic revenge on the strong. It was not born out of spiritual enlightenment, but out of resentment, a corrosive blend of envy, inferiority, and suppressed hatred. Nietzsche saw the origins of religious morality in the deep frustration of those who lacked power, beauty, wealth, or influence. Instead of admiring those who excelled, they resented them. But direct confrontation was impossible. So the weak invented a value system that reversed the natural order. The strong were rebranded as sinful, the proud as arrogant, the joyful as immoral. The downtrodden, meanwhile, were declared blessed. Meekness became a virtue. Suffering became holy. Religion, then, was a moral inversion, a clever trick by which the powerless could elevate themselves without actually rising. Rather than strive for greatness, they declared greatness evil. Rather than seek justice through strength, they waited for divine judgment. The rich man would burn in hell, while the beggar would be exalted in heaven. This was not love, it was revenge, dressed in sanctity. Nietzsche called this slave morality, and it infected not just theology but politics, culture, and education. The religious ideal taught people to suppress their instincts, deny their desires, and live in guilt. Life itself was seen as something to endure, not to celebrate. The body was sinful, ambition was suspect, and pleasure was shameful. Religion, in this light, became a narcotic, a sedative for existential rage. This narcotic effect dulled not only suffering, but the will to grow. People clung to religion not to become better, but to feel morally superior while remaining stagnant. It allowed the resentful to view themselves as righteous victims and the successful as wicked oppressors. It sanctified mediocrity and demonized excellence. In Nietzsche's words, religion turned life upside down and called it truth. He was particularly scathing toward the priestly class. Priests, he argued, were the ultimate manipulators of resentment. They capitalized on guilt and suffering, not to heal people, but to bind them. They offered redemption, but only through obedience. They offered meaning, but only within a narrative that celebrated weakness and condemned vitality. In doing so, they built spiritual empires on the broken backs of those they claimed to save. Nietzsche did not dismiss all spirituality. He admired ancient Greek religion for its life-affirming qualities. What he rejected was any belief system that encouraged people to hate life in the name of another world. Religion, when rooted in resentment, becomes not a source of truth, but a tool of psychological control. The final tragedy is that many who follow religion sincerely are unaware of its origins in bitterness. They are seeking comfort, but are handed chains. To be truly free, Nietzsche argued, one must kill the god of guilt and reclaim the self not in repentance, but in affirmation of life's raw, unapologetic power. Language is violence disguised as communication. Foucauldian, post-structuralist perspective. Language is often described as a bridge medium through which we express ourselves, connect with others, and share meaning. But Michel Foucault and other post-structuralist thinkers reveal a darker side to language. It is not merely descriptive or expressive, it is regulatory, hierarchical, and coercive. Language doesn't just reflect reality, it shapes it, and in doing so, it wields power. Language, in this view, is a form of violence, subtle, encoded, and institutionalized. Words are not neutral. They carry histories, assumptions, and exclusions. When a doctor diagnoses a child as developmentally delayed, it sounds clinical, but it's also a form of labeling that defines how that child is treated, educated, and perceived. When a politician labels a group as illegal, they're not describing, they're dehumanizing. These words don't merely describe reality. They construct a version of it, one that can justify control, surveillance, or exclusion. Foucault argued that discourse, the structured use of language around specific topics, determines what can be thought, said, and acted upon. In psychiatry, for example, the discourse around madness creates categories like schizophrenic, bipolar, or antisocial. These are not just medical truths. They are social constructions with real consequences. Once someone is labeled, institutions treat them according to that designation, limiting their rights, opportunities, and autonomy. Even everyday language enforces norms. Think about how insults or gendered terms police behavior. A boy called sissy is not just teased, he is being pushed back into the mold of acceptable masculinity. A woman who speaks assertively might be called bossy or aggressive, while a man doing the same is labeled confident. This is linguistic violence, not in the form of screaming or slurs alone, but in the way language inscribes limitations onto identity. Legal language is another example. Laws are written in language so complex that ordinary people can't understand it, creating a class divide between those who can interpret it and those who are subject to it. This is a form of epistemic violence control through selective access to meaning. The law is not merely a set of rules, it is a system of language that determines who can speak, who can be heard, and whose suffering counts. Even silence is shaped by language. Certain topics, rape, race, power, are silenced not through censorship alone, but by making the language around them taboo or too fraught to speak. When people lack the words to express their trauma or critique their oppression, the result is not peace, it is enforced quietude. The violence of language lies in its authority. It tells us what is real, what is deviant, what is worthy. It can elevate or erase. And because we internalize these codes from childhood, we often reproduce them unconsciously. We think we're simply communicating, when in fact we're reinforcing a system of power that thrives on categorization, exclusion, and control. Most people are too cowardly to create their own values. Nietzschean perspective. Friedrich Nietzsche believed that most people do not live authentically. They do not create their own values, they inherit them, absorb them, and follow them blindly. They accept what society, religion, tradition, or authority tells them is good and evil without ever questioning its origin or its function. This, for Nietzsche, is not merely laziness, it is cowardice. It is a fear of freedom, a terror of responsibility, and a refusal to confront the abyss of meaninglessness. Creating one's own values requires facing a terrifying reality, that there is no objective, universal, moral order. There is no divine script, no cosmic reward system. If God is dead, as Nietzsche declared, then morality is no longer handed down, it must be built from within. But to do this demands the strength to stand alone, to defy the herd, and to risk being wrong. It requires one to become an Übermensch, a creator of values rather than a consumer of them. The average person, Nietzsche argued, avoids this challenge. They cling to systems that tell them what to believe. Religious dogma, political ideologies, social conventions. These systems offer comfort, not truth. They simplify the world, reduce ambiguity, and provide ready-made identities. They allow people to outsource their moral agency. You don't have to ask, "What should I do?" You just obey. But this obedience comes at a cost. It turns individuals into what Nietzsche called last men content, safe, comfortable, and utterly mediocre. These people fear suffering, so they avoid passion. They fear judgment, so they never speak boldly. They fear failure, so they never create. They live according to the values of others, and in doing so, they become shadow-sexisting but never truly living. Even those who rebel often do so within the boundaries of the system. The so-called revolutionary still appeals to justice, still clings to moral narratives inherited from the very culture they oppose. True value creation means stepping outside of inherited frameworks entirely. It means asking, what do I believe? What does my life affirm? What am I willing to suffer for, not because it is good by some external standard, but because it is mine? This task is not for everyone. Nietzsche acknowledged that most people would never dare attempt it. They would rather be told what to think, how to behave, and what to value. They fear the vertigo of freedom, the weight of responsibility, the demand to become authors of their own existence. They would rather be slaves to morality than face the terror of creating their own. To live by your own values is to live dangerously. But for Nietzsche, this is the only life worth living. It is the path of the courageous few, the ones who dare to become themselves. Education indoctrinates more than it liberates. Foucauldian critique. We are taught to believe that education is a path to freedom, that it enlightens, empowers, and prepares individuals to think critically. But Michel Foucault and other radical thinkers argued the opposite. Education, in its institutional form, is less about liberation and more about indoctrination. It molds individuals to fit social norms, rewards conformity, and disciplines deviation. It creates not thinkers, but subjects. Schools operate as microcosms of society's power structures. They are hierarchical, bureaucratic, and surveillance-heavy. Children are monitored, tested, ranked, and categorized. From an early age, they are trained to obey bells, sit in rows, repeat after authority, and internalize standardized knowledge. This is not education, it is normalization. It teaches students not how to think, but what to think. Foucault saw schools as part of the broader disciplinary apparatus. Like prisons and hospitals, they exist to manage populations, not just individuals. They create docile bodies, citizens who are productive, obedient, and easily governed. The curriculum is not neutral. It reflects the values, history, and priorities of the dominant culture. What is taught and what is omitted shapes the worldview of every student. History lessons often glorify national achievements while minimizing atrocities. Literature selections reinforce cultural norms and exclude marginalized voices. Science is taught as an objective truth, yet funding, politics, and ideology influence what research is prioritized and which findings are promoted. Even seemingly harmless subjects like math are weaponized through standardized testing, sorting students into hierarchies that affect their future opportunities. Education is also deeply tied to economic utility. Students are trained not to explore, but to perform. Creativity is undervalued unless it serves capital. The arts are cut, critical thinking discouraged, and technical skills elevated. Universities, once bastions of independent thought, have become corporations driven by rankings, profit, and branding. Knowledge is commodified, and students become customers. Beyond content, education teaches passivity. Students are rarely invited to question the system itself. Those who do are labeled troublemakers. Critical pedagogy is replaced by rote learning. Grades become the measure of worth, not insight or growth. The goal is not to produce philosophers, artists, or revolutionaries. It is to produce compliant workers and loyal citizens. Foucault emphasized that power in education is most effective when it is invisible. Students believe they are choosing freely when in fact their choices are curated and constrained. They believe they are being educated, but often they are being shaped. The illusion of empowerment masks the machinery of control. True education would mean fostering radical thought, embracing discomfort, and challenging the status quo. It would prioritize questioning over memorization, and personal truth over institutional approval. But such education threatens the system, so it remains rare. To recognize this is not to despair, but to become conscious. The first step to real learning is unlearning the lies we've been taught to accept. Marriage is legalized suffering. Schopenhauerian critique. Arthur Schopenhauer viewed marriage not as a romantic ideal or a spiritual union, but as a cruel trap laid by nature and society, a contract that ensures suffering in the service of reproduction. To him, marriage is not an institution designed for love or fulfillment, but for the continuation of the species at the expense of the individual's freedom, peace, and happiness. It is legalized suffering, culturally celebrated, yet deeply rooted in biological deception and social control. At the core of Schopenhauer's view is the belief that love is an illusion created by the will to life. When individuals fall in love, they are not freely choosing a partner based on reason or personal compatibility. Rather, they are being manipulated by nature, driven by a blind urge to produce offspring with optimal genetic traits. The individual believes they are acting in pursuit of happiness, but they are actually obeying the demands of the species. The emotional intensity of love, the obsession, the euphoriates all nature's way of disguising its real goal. Once the biological mission is fulfilled and children are born, the illusion fades, passion dies, incompatibility surfaces, and the weight of obligation sets in. Yet society demands the continuation of the marital contract. Love was the bait, but duty is the trap. The couple, once intoxicated by nature's lie, now finds themselves bound to one another legally, morally, financially, often long after emotional intimacy has vanished. Marriage imposes constraints not only on personal freedom, but on spiritual and intellectual development. The individual is now responsible not only for themselves, but for a partner, children, and often a vast network of in-laws and expectations. Spontaneity is replaced by routine. Desire is replaced by obligation. What once felt transcendent becomes transactional. The home becomes a site of compromise, negotiation, and silent resentment. Schopenhauer was especially harsh in his view of women within the institution. He believed they were exploited doubly, first as vessels for reproduction and second as domestic laborers, expected to maintain the home and raise children without recognition. But he also saw men as victims coerced by romantic delusions into sacrificing their freedom and vitality for a role they did not fully understand. Both genders, in his view, are ensnared by the myth of romantic salvation. Even in modern times, marriage remains deeply linked to property, legality, and institutional regulation. It is often more about social status, tax advantages, and inheritance than emotional connection. The very need to legalize a relationship suggests a profound mistrust of natural bonds. If love were enough, why would the state need to intervene? Divorce, the growing response to this institution, only proves Schopenhauer's point. Marriage promises fulfillment, but delivers constraint. It wraps suffering in ritual, dresses sacrifice as virtue, and calls endurance love. It survives not because it works, but because it is too culturally ingrained to question without consequence. To Schopenhauer, marriage is not sacred. It is a biological contract disguised as spiritual union, a societal cage passed off as personal triumph, and a mechanism for suffering so normalized that we call it commitment. To be good is to obey. To be great is to defy. Nietzschean philosophy. Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy makes a sharp distinction between the morality of the obedient and the ethics of the exceptional. In his eyes, goodness, as defined by society, is synonymous with obedience. The good person is the one who follows rules, respects authority, and avoids risk. But greatness, true greatness, can never be achieved through submission. It requires defiance, rebellion, and the creation of new values. To be good is to fit in. To be great is to break out. Nietzsche believed that most moral systems, especially religious ones, were designed to keep the powerful in check and the weak in control. Goodness, in these systems, means being humble, selfless, passive, and forgiving. These traits are not inherently noble. They are convenient for maintaining social order. They keep individuals docile and predictable. In return, they are praised, rewarded, and declared virtuous. But this virtue is hollow. It is not strength, it is domestication. The truly great individual does not accept inherited values. They question them. They dismantle them. The great person, Nietzsche's Übermensch, does not ask what is right based on tradition or consensus. They create what is right based on their own experience, suffering, and will to power. Greatness means affirming life on one's own terms, even if those terms offend the herd. Obedience is comfortable. It shields the individual from responsibility. If you follow the rules, you can always say, "I was just doing what I was told." But defiance demands accountability. It means owning your decisions, your failures, and your truths. The defiant individual must live with the consequences of living honestly, not safely. This is why society often vilifies greatness. Rebels are dangerous. They unsettle the norm, challenge authority, and make others uncomfortable. History is full of figures, Socrates, Galileo, Nietzsche himself, who were punished not for being evil, but for refusing to obey. They were not good in the conventional sense. They were better. Nietzsche warned against what he called herd morality, a system where the majority dictates what is right and wrong. In such systems, creativity is crushed, genius is envied, and strength is softened. The herd praises sameness, not excellence. It fears difference. And so, it elevates obedience as the highest good, not because it leads to truth, but because it maintains safety. Greatness is not cruelty or domination. It is the courage to live without guarantees, to carve out meaning in a chaotic world, to be hated for the truths you tell and the beauty you create. It is not antisocial but transsocial. It does not destroy out of spite but creates out of necessity. In Nietzsche's framework, morality is not a universal law, it is a battlefield. The obedient survive, but the defiant transform. Goodness keeps the machine running, greatness changes the direction of history. Madness is a mirror to society's repression. Foucauldian perspective. Madness, often portrayed as a personal or neurological defect, is in many ways a reflection of the culture that defines it. Michel Foucault argued that what we call insanity is not a medical reality, but a social judgment. It is the label applied to those whose behaviors, beliefs, or identities deviate too far from the acceptable norms. Madness does not just reveal something about the individual, it exposes the unspoken fears, contradictions, and repressions of the society that condemns them. Before the rise of modern psychiatry, madness occupied a strange, often mystical space. In many pre-modern cultures, the mad were seen as possessed, touched by the gods, or attuned to otherworldly knowledge. But with the Enlightenment came a new obsession with reason, order, and control. Madness no longer fascinated it, threatened. The insane were now seen as dangerous, irrational, and in need of confinement. This shift wasn't driven by science, but by power. Foucault's Madness and Civilization charts how Western societies began to institutionalize the mad, not for their safety, but for the comfort of the sane. Asylums were not places of healing, they were warehouses of exclusion. They served to isolate those who refused, or were unable, to conform to the demands of industrial society. The mad were inconvenient, they didn't work, obey, or behave predictably. And so, they were pathologized. But what defines madness? Hallucinations, extreme moods, dissociation. These are symptoms, yes, but they are interpreted within a cultural lens. A vision that is called psychosis in one context might be considered prophecy in another. A sexual preference labeled deviant in one era is normalized in another. The boundaries of sanity are not fixed, they are drawn by those in power. Madness, in this view, becomes a form of resistance. The mad person is often someone who has absorbed too much suffering, too much contradiction, or too much truth. They break not because they are weak, but because they cannot reconcile the absurdity around them. A madwoman screaming in a street may be responding more honestly to injustice than those who walk by in silence. A schizophrenic's disordered speech may be the result of a world that no longer makes sense. Modern psychiatry, while more humane in appearance, still functions as a tool of normalization. Diagnostic manuals expand every year. More behaviors are classified, more drugs prescribed, more people labeled. While some benefit from treatment, others are numbed, silenced, or stigmatized. The problem is not curate, is control. Who decides what is sane? Who benefits from that decision? Foucault did not romanticize madness. He acknowledged its pain, but he insisted that we examine our response to it not just medically, but politically. When we pathologize dissent, we preserve the status quo. When we fear madness, we reveal what we are unwilling to face about ourselves. In the end, the mad are not just patients, they are messengers. And the institution that cages them tells us more about the jailers than the jailed. The world is driven by blind, irrational forces, not reason, Schopenhauerian perspective. Arthur Schopenhauer challenged the Enlightenment view that the universe is a rational system governed by logic, order, and moral clarity. To him, this was a delusione, comforting story, told by philosophers and scientists to impose structure on a world that is, at its core, chaotic and absurd. The real engine of existence is not reason, but a blind, irrational force he called the willa, metaphysical drive that underlies all being. This will is not conscious, not moral, not goal-directed. It simply strives, pushes, wants, and, in doing so, produces endless suffering. Everything in nature obeys this will. The tree grows, not because it reasons that growing is good, but because it is compelled. Animals fight, mate, and die, according to drives they do not choose. Humans, though equipped with consciousness and intellect, are no different. We believe we are rational agents, acting according to logic and ethics, but beneath our reasoning lies instinct, compulsion, and unconscious desire. Our intellect is merely the servant of the will, constructing justifications after the fact. We pursue careers, love, status, and power, believing these choices are rational. But Schopenhauer would argue we are simply acting out the will's demand to assert, survive, and replicate. The desire for sex, for example, appears personal and romantic, but it is a mechanism of the species to perpetuate itself. The individual believes in love stories and soulmates, but it is nature that is using that belief to ensure reproduction. Reason is not in control, it is a mask over primal necessity. Even history does not unfold rationally. Wars, revolutions, empires, and ideologies rise and fall, not because humanity learns and evolves, but because desire, fear, envy, and aggression continue to dominate human behavior. The idea that progress is inevitable through reason is, for Schopenhauer, naive. Civilization may change its clothes, but the same irrational forces, ambition, hatred, greed, continue to shape it. Schopenhauer also saw suffering as evidence of this irrational force. No rational system would create life forms destined to hunger, decay, and die. The natural world is indifferent to well-being. Predators must kill to live. The strong dominate the weak. The rain falls on the just and unjust alike. Reason, in this world, is a candle in a storm, flickering, fragile, and often self-deceiving. Modern examples only reinforce this view. Mass consumerism exploits psychological impulses. Political movements are driven by tribalism and fear more than debate and principle. Technological advancement, while impressive, does not bring peace. It accelerates distraction and existential anxiety. Rationality exists in small corner slabs, algorithms, courts, but it is not the foundation of the world. The foundation is chaos, craving, and the endless, irrational will. To live with this understanding is not to despair, but to see clearly. The world is not a system to be mastered through logic. It is a storm to be endured, a tide to be navigated, and a force to be confronted not with illusions of order, but with the clarity of hard truth. Forgiveness is often a form of superiority. Nietzschean perspective. Forgiveness is commonly portrayed as a moral triumph, a sign of inner peace, spiritual maturity, and ethical strength. But Friedrich Nietzsche offered a much more cynical interpretation. In his view, forgiveness often has little to do with reconciliation or love, and much more to do with power, control, and subtle condescension. To forgive is, frequently, to assert superiority under the guise of virtue. Forgiveness implies judgment. It means someone has wronged you, and you now possess the authority to release them from guilt. This act places the forgiver in a higher moral position. They become the arbiter of justice, the one who holds the power to condemn or absolve. Nietzsche would argue that this position is not neutral, it is hierarchical. Forgiveness becomes a form of dominance, a performance of righteousness that elevates the self over the other. In many cases, people forgive not out of compassion, but to assert moral high ground. They say, "I forgive you," not to reconnect, but to proclaim, "Look how evolved I am." This sanctimonious posture disguises judgment as grace. The one being forgiven is reminded of their guilt, their wrongdoing, their dependence on the mercy of another. Forgiveness, then, does not equal moral equality, it reinforces moral asymmetry. Nietzsche linked this dynamic to what he called slave morality, a system of values created by the weak to gain power over the strong. In this framework, the inability to take direct revenge or assert strength is sublimated into moral gestures like forgiveness, which appear noble but function as tools of control. The weak man, unable to strike back, forgives, and thereby claims moral superiority over the one who wronged him. He becomes the better person not by confronting power, but by shaming it through virtue. There is also a psychological payoff to forgiving. It allows individuals to feel elevated, wise, or spiritual. But Nietzsche would ask, is this forgiveness truly selfless? Or is it another form of ego, masked as humility? When we forgive someone and make sure they know it, we're not just letting go or exercising symbolic authority. Forgiveness also allows society to mask injustice. Institutions may forgive historical crimes, colonialism, slavery, oppression without addressing structural harm. A ritual apology, a moment of public forgiveness, and the system continues as before. The act of forgiving becomes a substitute for accountability. It cleanses guilt without changing conditions. The victim may be praised for forgiving, while the perpetrator remains unchallenged. This doesn't mean forgiveness is always false. Nietzsche acknowledged that strong individuals can forgive, but their forgiveness is not condescending. It is rooted in power, not weakness. They forgive because they no longer care, because they've moved beyond the injury. Their forgiveness is not a weapon, it is an act of strength. But such forgiveness is rare. Most forgiveness, in Nietzsche's eyes, is a strategy, not a virtue. It is a socially acceptable way of saying, I am above you. Justice is a mask for institutional revenge, Foucauldian critique. Justice, as presented in courts, legal systems, and state institutions, is wrapped in the language of fairness, balance, and moral order. But Michel Foucault exposed a far more troubling interpretation, that what society calls justice is often a thin disguise for revenge, systematized, sanitized, and legitimized by institutions. The courtroom, far from being a temple of truth, is frequently a theater of punishment, where power enacts vengeance while claiming neutrality. The origins of justice, historically, were rooted in personal revenge, an eye for an eye, a life for a life. These were raw, emotional reactions to harm. As societies evolved, these instincts were channeled into institutions. Retribution didn't disappear, it was rationalized. The state monopolized the right to punish, claiming to act in the name of order, not anger. But the emotional core remained intact. Punishment still satisfies a desire to hurt those who have broken rules. It just does so through procedure. Foucault argued that the penal system is less about correcting behavior and more about reasserting power. Criminals are not merely rehabilitated, they are marked, caged, and subjected to discipline. The language of justice conceals the deeper motive: to make an example, to deter, to dominate. The spectacle of trials and sentencing serves a function beyond resolution. It reaffirms the authority of the institution. The justice system claims to be impartial, but it is constructed and enforced by those in power. Laws are written, interpreted, and enforced in ways that reflect dominant ideologies. Acts committed by the marginalized are prosecuted harshly, while the crimes of the powerful are often ignored or obscured. The courtroom, in this sense, becomes a stage where society rehearses its hierarchies under the guise of principle. Even the rituals of justice are telling. The robes, gavels, oaths, and language all evoke a sense of sacred procedure. But behind this pageantry lies the same old impulse: to inflict suffering in return for violation. The death penalty, long prison sentences, solitary confinement, these are not acts of rational correction. They are expressions of collective revenge, executed with institutional flair. Modern justice often avoids bloodshed, but it replaces it with social death. A person convicted of a crime loses not just freedom, but identity. They are labeled, tracked, and stigmatized for life. This isn't rehabilitation, it is branding. The system may claim to uphold rights, but it also ensures exclusion. Justice, in this model, doesn't heal, it isolates. Foucault's critique extends further. The justice system trains citizens to internalize surveillance, fear, and obedience. The threat of punishment disciplines society long before the crime is committed. This anticipatory control is more effective than violence. People behave because they fear being judged. Justice is thus not just revenge on individuals, it is a system of population management. By masking revenge as principle, justice becomes immune to critique. Who would question fairness? But when fairness is administered by systems of control, it ceases to be justice. It becomes power-calm, bureaucratic, and relentless in its need to punish. Humanity prefers comforting lies over painful truths. Schopenhauer, Nietzsche synthesis. Human beings claim to seek truth, but more often than not, they flee from it. The reality is too cold, too vast, too indifferent. Truth, especially when unfiltered, rarely nourishes, it wounds. So humanity retreats into comforting lies: religion, nationalism, romantic ideals, economic myths, and personal delusions. These lies provide shelter from the chaos and pointlessness that lurk behind the veil of existence. To Schopenhauer, the truth is suffering. To Nietzsche, the truth is that there are no truths, only interpretations born of power and survival, and both recognize the same fact. Most people would rather believe in fictions that soothe than realities that burn. Societies function by agreeing upon shared narratives. They create myths of justice, progress, divine purpose, and moral order. These myths aren't supported by evidence, they are emotionally necessary. They hold the collective psyche together. Take religion. Belief in a benevolent deity who watches over the world provides comfort in the face of mortality and suffering. The idea of an afterlife softens the brutality of death. Whether or not these concepts are true is almost irrelevant. Their psychological utility is what matters. People believe not because the evidence compels them, but because the alternative is unbearable. Even in secular modernity, comforting lies persist. Capitalism is framed as fair. Hard work is promised to yield success. Love is idealized as destiny. Governments claim to represent the people. These are not empirical realities, they are moral fictions designed to keep people invested in systems that exploit them. When reality intrudes, when injustice is revealed, when death comes too soon, when effort goes unrewarded, people often double down on the lie, rather than confront the raw truth. The educational system often reinforces these fictions. Children are taught that historical atrocities were exceptions, not systems. They are told that goodness is always rewarded and evil punished. As they grow, many realize this is not the case, but rather than abandoning the myths, they simply reshape them. They call their cynicism realism, but still cling to the hope that some order, some meaning, underpins it all. The brutal truth that life is often indifferent, and justice arbitrarious, rarely acknowledged in full. Psychologically, the human mind is built to seek patterns, even when none exist. Cognitive biases like confirmation bias and cognitive dissonance ensure that people prioritize coherence over truth. A belief that makes one feel safe will be protected, even when evidence contradicts it. This is not stupidity, it is survival. The mind evolved to preserve well-being, not to uncover existential terror. The painful truths about mortality, randomness, injustice, isolation, require a strength most are not taught to develop. Nietzsche called for the tragic hero, someone willing to stare into the abyss and affirm life anyway. But such individuals are rare. Most would rather soften the abyss with fairy tales. To live without illusion is possible, but it is difficult, often lonely, and always uncomfortable. The comforting lie offers company. The painful truth offers clarity. And most people, given the choice, would rather be comforted than clear. Sex is never just sex, it's about dominance and structure, Foucauldian perspective. Michel Foucault challenged the idea that sex is a purely biological, personal, or pleasurable act. In his view, sex is deeply political. It is not merely a private interaction, it is a social ritual infused with power, structure, and regulation. Sex, far from being a space of liberation, is shaped by discourses that define what is normal, what is deviant, and who holds control. From birth, people are assigned roles: male, female, masculine, feminine, dominant, submissive. These roles are enforced not only by culture, but by institutions, schools, religions, governments, and the medical establishment. These institutions regulate sex not just in terms of legality, but in terms of language, behavior, and expectation. Sexuality becomes a terrain of control. Who you can desire, how you should perform, what identities you must fit into. The idea that sex is a private, harmless exchange between consenting adults ignores the structural context. Consent itself is shaped by power. Who feels free to say no? Who feels entitled to pursue? Who is trained to please, and who is taught to demand? Sex, in this view, is always layered with dominance, even when it appears egalitarian. Gender norms dictate positions of power long before anyone enters the bedroom. Foucault argued that modern societies are obsessed with sex not to liberate it, but to control it. In earlier eras, sexuality may have been repressed, but today it is constantly discussed, categorized, medicalized, and politicized. From pornography to public health campaigns, sex is surveilled and regulated. The language of liberation, be yourself. Own your sexuality. often disguises new forms of discipline. You're still being told what to be just in more seductive ways. Sexual identity, too, is structured. Labels like heterosexual, gay, queer, asexual, or non-binary create frameworks for recognition and visibility, but they also create new norms. Visibility can be empowering, but it also creates new forms of surveillance. Once you declare who you are, institutions know how to treat you. The self becomes a profile, a target, a data point. Sex is never just sex. It is entangled with classification. Even pleasure is shaped. What we desire, how we experience satisfaction, is learned. Bodies are trained. Techniques are taught. Standards are reinforced. Media constructs ideal sexual experiences. Orgasm becomes a performance, not just a sensation. Behind the act is a script, and most people are reading from it without realizing. They're not just doing, they're obeying. Sexual violence, in this framework, is not an aberration but an expression of deeper cultural codes. It reflects not just individual pathology, but collective structures that link power to desire, control to pleasure. To address violence, we must examine the entire system, not just prosecute criminals, but interrogate the scripts that trained them. Foucault's insight is simple but radical. Sex is never neutral. It's embedded in systems of control. Every kiss, every touch, every moan echoes with centuries of power. Liberation is not found in ignoring this, but in seeing it clearly. Genius is loneliness weaponized, Schopenhauerian and Nietzschean fusion. Genius is often romanticized as brilliance, talent, or divine inspiration. But at its core, genius is isolation made powerful. It is the experience of being radically alone cognitively, emotionally, spiritually, and transmuting that alienation into creation. Genius is not born from comfort, but from exile. It is what happens when the individual, cut off from the herd, forges meaning in the void. Schopenhauer saw the genius as someone cursed with heightened sensitivity. They see what others ignore. They feel more intensely, think more deeply, and therefore suffer more. The ordinary world, its noise, distractions, trivialities grates on them. They are misunderstood not because they are eccentric, but because they operate on a different frequency. This misunderstanding creates distance. The genius becomes isolated not by choice, but by nature. Nietzsche took this further. He viewed the genius not as a victim of solitude, but as someone who weaponizes it. The genius rejects conformity, defies morality, and creates new values. Their solitude becomes the forge where old truths are melted down and new ones are cast. The Übermensch does not fear loneliness. They embrace it as the cost of authenticity. While the herd seeks comfort, the genius seeks clarity even if it burns. This solitude is both external and internal. Genius often means intellectual exile. Few understand your ideas, fewer support them. It also means emotional estrangement. Intimacy becomes difficult when your worldview doesn't match anyone else's. Relationships strain under the weight of unspeakable thoughts. The genius walks a road others can't see, let alone follow. But this loneliness is not barren. It becomes a crucible. In solitude, the genius distills experience into insight. They observe what others overlook, synthesize contradictions, and create beauty from pain. Van Gogh's swirling skies were born in an asylum. Nietzsche's greatest works were written in isolation, plagued by illness and rejection. Kafka wrote in secret, unread in his lifetime. Their work was not applause, it was necessity. Society often fears the genius, while simultaneously needing them. Institutions reward conformity, but culture is moved forward by those who reject the script. Genius threatens stability. It says, things could be different, and worse. Things are not what you think. This is dangerous. That's why geniuses are often dismissed, ridiculed, or destroyed in their lifetimes, and only celebrated when they are safely dead. Genius is not egoite. is agony transfigured. It is the ability to stand at the edge of understanding and speak what you see, even if no one listens. It is the courage to endure loneliness, not as a burden, but as a space of transformation. The genius does not escape loneliness. They make it their language. Most people seek company. The genius seeks vision, and that vision, born of solitude, becomes their weapon against a world that would rather remain blind. Society fears the strong and punishes their will, Nietzschean perspective. Friedrich Nietzsche believed that truly strong individuals, those who dare to think, act, and live outside the moral and cultural norms, are not admired by society, but feared. Civilization, with its systems of laws, morality, and etiquette, does not celebrate power, it contains it. It punishes the will that refuses to be domesticated. The strong are seen not as visionaries, but as threats. And society, under the guise of justice or decency, neutralizes them. The strong, in Nietzsche's view, are not bullies or tyrants. They are the ones who create their own values, who live with intensity, and who do not bow to herd morality. Their strength is spiritual and existential. It threatens the masses not because it harms them, but because it exposes their mediocrity. The strong remind the crowd of what they are not: free, courageous, self-possessed. This fear translates into repression. The exceptional are pathologized, criminalized, or trivialized. In ancient times, the philosopher who questioned the gods was forced to drink poison. In modern times, the nonconformist is often labeled antisocial, dangerous, or insane. Their passion is rebranded as aggression, their independence as arrogance. Society cannot tolerate those who do not ask permission to be who they are. This repression is subtle. It wears the mask of morality. We are taught that humility is a virtue, that obedience is maturity, that ambition must be tempered by compromise. Children are told not to stand out. Workers are rewarded for following orders. Even art and speech are policed not with brute force, but with ridicule, censorship, and cancellation. The will to power, when expressed openly, is seen as narcissism, cruelty, or delusion. But the weak do not punish the strong. Only out of envy, they do so to maintain the illusion of safety. Strong individuals destabilize the consensus reality. They ask forbidden questions. They reject fake virtue. They embody a freedom that cannot be legislated. And that freedom is contagious. If left unchecked, it inspires others to rebel. This is what society truly fears. Not the individual strongman, but the spread of strength. Religions have long participated in this containment. They preach submission, sacrifice, and guilt as sacred duties. The strong man who trusts himself, who affirms life in all its chaos, who refuses to kneel, is called sinful. He is accused not because he is immoral, but because he cannot be controlled. Christendom exalted the meek. Nietzsche called for the rise of the Übermenschone, who transcends good and evil and reclaims creative will. The irony is that society owes its progress to such people. Every breakthrough, scientific, artistic, philosophical, came from those who defied convention. Yet, these same figures were often punished in their time and only praised once safely buried. The strong are first mocked, then exiled, then mythologized. Their will is unwelcome until it can be used to decorate textbooks and museums. The truth is simple. Society does not nurture strength, it survives by suppressing it. And those with the courage to be strong must do so knowing that their path will be lonely, difficult, and opposed at every turn. But that defiance is precisely what makes them great. Punishment is not for reform but for control, Foucauldian critique. Michel Foucault argued that modern punishment is not primarily about justice, reformation, or deterrence, it is about control. The prison, the courtroom, the psychiatric hospital, these are not sites of moral correction but instruments of discipline. Society punishes not to heal but to label, categorize, and manage deviance. Behind every sentence, every fine, every correctional policy is the quiet machinery of social control. In pre-modern societies, punishment was spectacular public executions, mutilations, shame. These rituals were not just about the individual being punished, they were a message to the public: this is what happens when you disobey. But over time, such displays were replaced by more humane systems: prisons, therapy, surveillance. This shift didn't eliminate cruelty, it refined it. Violence became invisible, embedded in walls, schedules, paperwork, diagnoses. Foucault's analysis in Discipline and Punish showed how prisons do not rehabilitate. Instead, they produce a new kind of person, the criminal. Once labeled, the individual is tracked, studied, and monitored. They are excluded from normal society, not just physically but symbolically. They become a type, an identity. Punishment is not about fixing them, it is about defining them, making them intelligible to the system. This logic extends beyond the prison. Schools discipline students with grades, detention, and psychological labels. Workplaces punish with demotion or termination. Hospitals regulate with medication and institutionalization. The techniques vary, but the function is the same: to normalize behavior and suppress disruption. Even the language of punishment is loaded. We speak of correctional facilities and justice systems as though the goal were moral restoration. But recidivism rates remain high. Prisons often brutalize more than they heal. The system doesn't fail, it functions exactly as designed: to isolate nonconformity, render it visible, and manage it. Foucault also emphasized how punishment operates through surveillance. The threat of being watched disciplines people more effectively than force. The panopticon, his metaphorical prison design, describes a system in which individuals never know if they're being watched, so they police themselves. This self-regulation becomes internalized. You don't need guards if people censor their own behavior. Punishment extends into race, class, and economic structures. Policing disproportionately targets marginalized groups, not because of higher criminality, but because they are easier to control. The law does not protect everyone. Equally, it enforces hierarchies. The wealthy are fined, the poor are jailed. White-collar criminals manipulate systems. Street criminals are made examples. Justice, under this model, is not blind, it's strategic. Society uses punishment to reinforce norms. It draws lines between acceptable and deviant, productive and useless, sane and insane. Reform becomes a justification, not a purpose. Even when framed as compassion, punishment retains its disciplinary core. A rehab center may be more pleasant than a prison, but it still functions to redirect behavior under institutional supervision. Foucault's insight reveals that, to understand punishment, we must stop asking, "Does it work?" and start asking, "What does it serve? Who gains from this system? Who is silenced by it?" The answers expose punishment for what it truly is, not a moral necessity, but a political strategy. Ethics are historically contingent power games, Foucauldian and Nietzschean perspective. Ethics is often presented as a universal guide to right and wrong, grounded in reason, religion, or human nature. But both Michel Foucault and Friedrich Nietzsche argued that ethics are not eternal truths. They are temporary agreements, shaped by power, culture, and historical circumstance. What is called moral in one era is condemned in another. Ethics, then, are not about truth, they are about control. Foucault insisted that morality does not exist outside of discourse. Every moral code emerges within a particular configuration of knowledge and power. The ancient Greeks saw sex between men as educational. Modern conservatives see it as immoral. Medieval Christians celebrated self-flagellation as holy suffering. Today, it would be classified as mental illness. These shifts don't reflect deeper truths being discovered, they reflect shifts in who has the authority to define truth. Nietzsche went further, calling traditional morality a lie told by the weak. He argued that dominant moral systems, especially those derived from Christianity, were created to suppress the will to power. Strength, ambition, and pride were rebranded as sins. Obedience, humility, and meekness became virtues. This was not enlightenment, it was strategy. The weak could not defeat the strong through force, so they created moral systems to shame them into submission. Both thinkers exposed how ethical claims often disguise social agendas. When governments speak of family values, they are not appealing to truth, but defending a power structure. When corporations launch campaigns about integrity, they are deflecting scrutiny while reinforcing trust in a rigged system. The language of ethics often masks a deeper desire to preserve order and authority. Even modern liberal ethics, freedom, equality, tolerance, are historically contingent. They arose in reaction to specific cultural and economic needs. The Enlightenment promoted reason and liberty, but only for white, land-owning men. Civil rights and feminist ethics emerged not from a discovery of justice, but from collective struggle. Ethics evolve because societies change, because truth is finally found. Ethics also function through normalization. Schools, media, and religion teach what is right, but rarely explain why it is right. Morality becomes habit. Most people don't reflect on ethics, they absorb them. The result is a population that polices itself, shaming deviation without questioning the basis of its judgment. This is moral discipline, not freedom. To understand ethics as power games is not to descend into nihilism, it is to become aware. Once we recognize that morals are constructed, we can ask better questions. Who created these rules? Who benefits from them? What do they suppress? What alternatives are possible? This awareness opens the door to ethical innovation, not based on tradition, but on conscious, courageous evaluation. Ethics are not sacred, they are political. They can liberate, or they can oppress. And every time someone says, "This is right," the real question should be, according to whom? And for what purpose? Suffering is the essence of life. Schopenhauerian perspective. Arthur Schopenhauer did not see suffering as incidental to life, he saw it as its core. According to his metaphysics, to live is to suffer, and to suffer is to live. The source of this condition is the will-blind, aimless force that drives all existence. This will manifests in humans as endless desire, and with desire comes dissatisfaction, frustration, and pain. The cycle is unrelenting. We want, we pursue, we sometimes attain, and then we want again. Even joy is tainted, because it is merely the temporary absence of want, not a state in itself, but a relief from the deeper, ever-churning engine of yearning. From the moment we are born, we are subjected to the mechanics of the will. The infant cries, not because of rational thought, but because of unmet needs. This pattern never stops. Hunger, loneliness, insecurity, ambition, lust, these are the hands of the will guiding our lives. Schopenhauer believed that animals suffer less because they are unaware. Humans, cursed with consciousness, suffer doubly. They feel pain, and they understand it. They know it will return. They imagine future pain. They regret past pain. Their intellect does not free. Themit amplifies their torment. Even pleasure, when examined closely, is bound to the same logic. It is not a positive force, it is a brief silencing of the will. We eat to stop the pain of hunger. We make love to silence the ache of loneliness or the compulsion of biology. But these silences are momentary. The will returns. A full belly becomes an empty one. A moment of affection becomes longing again. Fulfillment never lasts. The so-called good life is simply one where suffering is postponed or disguised. Wealth doesn't eliminate suffering, it refines it. The rich suffer from boredom, existential angst, and the pressure of maintaining status. The poor suffer from deprivation, insecurity, and the humiliation of powerlessness. No class, no condition, is exempt from the workings of the will. The difference is only an aesthetic. Even love, which is glorified as the pinnacle of human experience, is another vehicle of suffering. It is riddled with jealousy, loss, longing, rejection. And even when reciprocated, love does not end, pain it, shifts it. The beloved becomes the object of fear, fear of change, of betrayal, of death. The will infiltrates even our most cherished moments, corrupting them with its relentless pull. Schopenhauer did not propose a cheerful remedy. His solution was not hope, but renunciation. Art, music, philosophy, and asceticism offered temporary escapes. The artist, lost in creation, can silence the will momentarily. The monk, through denial of desire, can weaken its grip. But there is no permanent freedom. Life, as such, is not a gift, it is a trial. To live with clarity is to recognize that suffering is not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be understood. It is the fabric of existence. To escape it entirely would require ceasing to live. Until then, suffering is not just part of life, it is its essence. Only a few can bear the truth. Most need illusions, Nietzschean perspective. Nietzsche believed that truth is not liberating for most people, it is unbearable. Reality, when stripped of comforting narratives and moral illusions, is cold, chaotic, and indifferent. It contains no inherent meaning, no divine justice, no ultimate reward. To face this truth without flinching requires a rare kind of strength. Most people cannot bear it. They require illusions not because they are foolish, but because they are human. These illusions take many forms. Religion provides the most potent. It offers a structured universe, a moral order, and the promise of justice beyond the grave. It turns suffering into sanctity and weakness into virtue. Even the cruelties of existence are repackaged as divine tests. This is not truth, it is wishful thinking elevated to metaphysical doctrine. And yet, it provides comfort. For the vast majority, it is better to believe a beautiful lie than to confront a meaningless abyss. Beyond religion, there is morality. Societies teach that good and evil are objective categories, that right conduct will be rewarded, and that fairness is universal. Nietzsche saw these as constructs socially useful, but fundamentally false. Morality, in his view, was a tool of the weak to control the strong. It dressed up envy as righteousness and obedience as goodness. It kept people docile, predictable, and manageable. Even science, for all its rigor, can become an illusion when it is worshipped as a new dogma. The belief that knowledge alone will save humanity, that reason is supreme, that progress is inevitable, these are secular myths. They shield the mind from deeper existential threats. Technology grows, but wisdom does not. Loneliness increases. Anxiety spreads. And still, we cling to the illusion of advancement. Nietzsche contrasted this with the rare individual who dares to confront the naked truth. This person does not believe in gods, in fixed morality, or in historical destiny. They understand that life is a will to power, a dance of chaos, and becoming a stage without a script. This person is not nihilistic in the passive sense. They do not collapse under the weight of meaninglessness. They rise above it. They create meaning where none exists. They become their own source of value. But this strength is exceptional. Most people need stories to live. They need purpose given to them, not forged. They need to believe that their suffering matters, that their lives fit into a larger plan. Nietzsche did not mock them for this, he pitied them, but he also warned against building civilizations on lies. Eventually, the illusion collapses, and when it does, the herd panics. The truth is not democratic. It does not care who believes in it. It demands strength. To bear it without illusion, to stand in the storm without shelterus, to become something rare. Not a moralist, not a preacher, but a creator, a truth-bearer. And most cannot walk that path. Discipline is the architecture of social submission, Foucauldian perspective. Michel Foucault's analysis of power redefined how we understand discipline. It is not merely about punishment or structure, it is a system of control so thorough, so subtle, that it shapes behavior at the cellular level of society. Discipline is the architecture upon which submission is built. It conditions bodies, regulates time, and sculpts thought. It does not scream at whispers, and in doing so, it becomes internalized. People obey not because they are forced to, but because they have been taught how to. Discipline, in Foucault's view, is not restricted to prisons. It is embedded in schools, factories, hospitals, offices, and even homes. These institutions share a common logic. They measure, monitor, categorize, and correct. The school does not merely teach, it surveils. The hospital does not just heal, it labels. The office does not simply employ, it disciplines. Every schedule, every report card, every employee review is a tool of normalization. You are not just performing, you are conforming. The physical spaces we occupy reflect this logic. Rows of desks, security cameras, time clocks, and ID badges are not accidents, they are instruments. They signal hierarchy, they demand legibility. You are always being watched, evaluated, compared. This constant observation reshapes behavior. The gaze becomes internalized. You start monitoring yourself. Foucault used the metaphor of the panopticon circular prison, where inmates cannot see the guard but know they might be watched at any moment. This design ensures self-discipline. It is efficient. You don't need force when you have fear. And this model applies to modern society. We post on social media and adjust our image based on likes and comments. We calculate how we speak in public, what we wear, what we believe. Discipline has become ambient. The goal of this system is not freedom, it is predictability. Disciplined populations are easier to manage. They are more productive, less rebellious, and more economically valuable. Discipline turns citizens into data points, bodies into workers, souls into consumers. The rhetoric is always positive: excellence, efficiency, self-improvement, but the result is always submission. The more optimized we become, the more obedient. Even resistance is shaped by discipline. Movements that challenge the system are quickly absorbed into it. Activism becomes branded. Dissent becomes managed. The system does not break, it adapts. It absorbs critique and repackages it as marketable identity. Discipline doesn't just suppress opposition, it redesigns it. This system of control is so effective because it is invisible. There are no shackles, only metrics. No whip, only goals. No master, only expectations. And because we believe we are choosing freely, we rarely question who set the parameters of our choices. Discipline is not the opposite of freedom, it is freedom engineered. It is the invisible scaffolding of modern life, holding us in place while convincing us we are moving forward. To see it clearly is to begin the work of unlearning, not to escape discipline entirely, but to stop mistaking it for liberty. Art is the escape from the nightmare of willing, Schopenhauerian perspective. Arthur Schopenhauer believed that life is driven by the will, a blind, irrational force that compels all living beings to strive, desire, compete, and suffer. The will is never satisfied. Every fulfilled desire gives birth to a new one, and the cycle continues until death. It is relentless. It governs not just human behavior, but the entirety of nature. According to Schopenhauer, this makes existence a kind of nightmare dream in which beings are trapped in ceaseless craving and inevitable suffering. Yet in this bleak metaphysical landscape, Schopenhauer identified one form of temporary salvation: art. Art, for him, is not merely entertainment or expression, it is metaphysical anesthesia. It suspends the workings of the will. When one is fully immersed in aesthetic experience, listening to a symphony, staring at a painting, reading poetry on steps outside the cycle of desire, one no longer wants, fears, plans, or competes. Instead, one observes, contemplates, and simply is. This contemplative state is rare. Most of life is lived in the grip of willing. We are hungry, tired, anxious, ambitious. But the aesthetic experience allows a disinterested perception of reality. We stop being individuals and become vessels for perception. In front of great art, Schopenhauer claimed, we are not the suffering person trying to win, gain, or escape. We are the pure subject of knowledge. Art does not remove pain by solving problems. It removes the very need to solve them. Different forms of art offer varying degrees of escape. The visual arts painting, sculpture, architecture freeze moments in time. They capture the Platonic ideas behind transient objects, letting the viewer momentarily access a realm beyond individuation. Literature does something similar, but with language. Tragedy, in particular, is powerful because it confronts the suffering inherent in existence and elevates it to something noble and meaningful. It shows that pain can be transcended, not by erasing it, but by transmuting it into beauty. But the highest form of art, according to Schopenhauer, is music. Unlike visual art, music does not represent the will, it is the will made audible. It bypasses the world of phenomena and speaks directly to our inner essence. It captures the movement of striving itself, the tension of chords, the resolution of melody, the recurrence of themes. Listening to music allows one to feel the deep structure of existence without engaging in it. It is the most profound way to touch truth without pain. This escape, however, is temporary. No aesthetic experience lasts forever. The will always returns. Hunger returns. Anxiety returns. But during those moments of artistic immersion, we taste something higher, a silence beneath the noise of striving. We remember that it is possible, even briefly, to exist without wanting. And in a world where wanting is suffering, that moment of stillness is the closest thing to redemption. Art does not save us from life, but it gives us a reprieve, a glimpse beyond the veil, a breath between the contractions of the will. And for Schopenhauer, that glimpse is everything. Morality is a lie, told by the mediocre to the exceptional, Nietzschean perspective. Friedrich Nietzsche saw morality not as a universal truth, but as a political tool crafted by the weak, the fearful, and the resentful to bind, shame, and suppress the strong. In his view, the exceptional individual, the artist, the warrior, the creator, the thinker, threatens the order and comfort of the average person. Rather than rise to meet greatness, the mediocre redefine it as evil. They weaponize morality to invert value itself. What is noble becomes arrogant, what is vital becomes vulgar, and what is weak becomes good. This inversion of values is what Nietzsche called the slave revolt in morality. It was not a philosophical evolution, it was an act of revenge. The masses, unable to match the power or radiance of the exceptional, created a moral framework that cast those traits as sins. Pride became a vice. Dominance became cruelty. Independence became rebellion. Meanwhile, humility, meekness, and obedience were rebranded as virtues. This new morality did not arise from strength, it arose from resentment. Resentment is not mere envy. It is the deeply internalized bitterness of those who cannot act on their will to power. Rather than admit inferiority, they transform it into moral superiority. They say, I could dominate, but I choose not to. I could create, but I am too righteous to pursue ego. This is the lie. It is not self-controlled, it is self-deception turned into doctrine. Religious systems, especially Christianity, are for Nietzsche the ultimate expression of this moral lie. Christianity champions the downtrodden, the poor, the meek. It sanctifies suffering and vilifies joy. It tells the strong to feel guilt for their power, and the weak to feel pride in their weakness. The cross becomes a symbol, not of triumph, but of surrender. The exceptional man is asked not to lead but to kneel. This moral structure permeates politics, education, and social norms. Children are taught to be nice, not to be truthful. Workers are praised for obedience, not innovation. Artists are rewarded when their work is palatable, not when it is visionary. The crowd cheers mediocrity because it reflects their own limitations. They despise what exceeds them unless it conforms to their values. Nietzsche called for a revaluation of all values. a world where morality is not dictated by the lowest common denominator but inspired by excellence, where the exceptional are not chained by guilt but liberated by strength. This does not mean cruelty or tyranny, it means authenticity. The will to power must not be smothered under moral chains, it must be cultivated into greatness. The exceptional individual does not need morality, they need courage. They create their own values, they live beyond good and evil. They are not concerned with being liked or approved. They are concerned with becoming what only they can be. Morality, as it is commonly practiced, is a form of social control, a myth repeated so often it is mistaken for truth. But for those with the eyes to see and the will to defy, it is revealed for what it is, a lie told by the mediocre to protect themselves from the force of greatness. The family is a microcosm of oppression, Foucauldian and radical perspective. The family is often portrayed as the cornerstone of society, a place of love, support, and protection. But Michel Foucault and radical social theorists would argue that beneath this sentimental image lies a more disturbing truth. The family is the first institution where individuals are subjected to discipline, hierarchy, and control. It is not separate from power, it is where power begins. The family is a microcosm of oppression, reproducing the very structures society later expands. From birth, the child is not welcomed into freedom, but into a world of commands. Parents set the rules. The child learns quickly that obedience is rewarded and defiance punished. This is the first experience of authoritarian power, cloaked in care. "Because I said so," becomes the introduction to arbitrary authority. There is no negotiation. Love becomes conditional. Good behavior earns affection. Rebellion earns withdrawal. Foucault's concept of disciplinary power applies perfectly to the family. The home, like the school or prison, is a site of surveillance. The child is watched, evaluated, and corrected. They are taught to internalize normsto, speak a certain way, act a certain way, believe certain things. The body is trained, sit up straight. The speech is edited, don't talk back, and the emotions are policed. Stop crying. Before the state ever touches the individual, the family has already shaped them to fit. Gender roles are enforced here as well. Boys are told to be strong, to suppress vulnerability. Girls are told to be nurturing, obedient, pretty. These roles are not genetic. They are social scripts passed down through generations. The father becomes a symbol of law, the mother of care, and children are cast into roles with no consent. Any deviation, queerness, rebellion, nonconformities, punished directly or subtly, reinforcing a binary order. The family also reproduces economic oppression. It teaches hierarchy, parents rule, children serve. This habituates people to larger systems, bosses, landlords, police, state. The child learns that survival depends on pleasing those in power. Economic inequality is modeled within the home before it is experienced in society. Patriarchy and capitalism are not merely public systems, they are trained in private. Abuse, too, is often hidden behind the sanctity of the family. Emotional manipulation, control, neglect, even physical violence are justified as discipline or tough love. The family shields itself with ideology. Blood is thicker than water, family is forever. Questioning it is taboo. This ideological armor makes it nearly immune to critique. Loyalty is demanded, even when harm is present. This is not to say that love does not exist in families. It does. But love alone does not negate structure. Love can coexist with domination. And in the traditional family, it often does. The family, then, is not merely a refugiate, is a factory. It produces obedient citizens, gendered bodies, moral agents, and economic subjects. It is where the architecture of control is first drawn. To transform society, one must first understand that power does not begin in politics, it begins at home. Most people live as if they were never truly alive. Existentialist, Nietzschean synthesis. Most people exist without ever truly living. They conform, obey, and repeat patterns they never chose, mistaking movement for purpose, routine for meaning, and comfort for fulfillment. They are not alive in any profound sense. They are sleepwalking through borrowed lives. Friedrich Nietzsche, Søren Kierkegaard, and later existentialists all pointed toward this terrifying possibility, that human beings, gifted with consciousness and freedom, overwhelmingly choose denial, distraction, and dullness. To be truly alive means to live authentically. It means confronting the terrifying freedom that existence grants, that there is no script, no preordained purpose, no divine blueprint. But this truth is unbearable to most. Instead of embracing freedom, they flee from it. They seek ready-made identities. They adopt inherited values. They believe what their parents believed, pursue what their peers chase, and fear what their society tells them to avoid. Nietzsche called them the herd. They are not evil, just indifferent to truth. They live according to social consensus. Their dreams are outsourced, their morality is recycled. They may never cause harm, but neither do they create. They fear pain more than they desire depth. Their greatest ambition is to be left undisturbed, to survive, retire, and die quietly. But this is not living. This is a comfortable form of death in life. Kierkegaard observed that the crowd is untruth. The individual who dissolves into the collective loses their self. They become a mask, a function, a placeholder. They avoid the despair of freedom by filling their lives with distraction work, entertainment, gossip, shallow relationships, but underneath this noise is dread. The dread that they have never made a real decision, that they have never loved freely, believed freely, or acted freely. Modern life makes this easier than ever. Consumer culture offers endless distraction. Social media provides validation without intimacy. Political systems reduce engagement to slogans. Even spiritual life is commodified into safe, palatable packages. We are taught to optimize, but not to awaken, to perform, but not to reflect. We pursue productivity, not presence. To be truly alive is not a constant state, it is a decision made again and again. It means choosing meaning over habit, truth over comfort, and self-authorship over passive inheritance. It requires courage to stand apart, to risk rejection, to fail meaningfully. It requires the strength to carry the weight of existence without numbing it with conformity. The rare individual who dares to live this way is often misunderstood. They are called eccentric, rebellious, arrogant. But their crime is simply that they did not settle. They insisted on being awake. They insisted on not dying before death. Most people do not make this choice. They live quietly, painlessly, invisibly. They obey, they consume, and they vanish without ever knowing who they were or what life could have been. Philosophy should offend, not comfort, cynical, radical tradition. Philosophy, in its truest form, is not polite conversation, it is intellectual combat. It is meant to disturb the complacent, to provoke the conformist, to unsettle the comfortable. It should offend. Not for the sake of shock, but because the truth, when it is spoken honestly, rarely flatters its audience. The moment philosophy becomes comfortable, it becomes ideology. It stops questioning and starts affirming. It becomes a mirror for the crowd instead of a hammer to shatter illusions. The great philosophers were not therapists. Socrates offended Athens so deeply with his relentless questioning that they sentenced him to death. Diogenes mocked every social institution, living in a barrel, urinating in public, and calling out hypocrisy wherever he saw it. Nietzsche declared God dead and labeled morality a lie. Schopenhauer told us that life is suffering and that hope is delusion. None of these men offered comfort. They offered confrontation. Modern culture has neutered philosophy. It has been sanitized into life advice, commodified into TED Talks, or buried in inaccessible jargon. But the real purpose of philosophy is to make you uncomfortable with your life. It should ask, Why do you believe what you believe? Who gave you your values? Are your hopes your own, or were they sold to you? Philosophy should strip you naked, expose the machinery inside your mind, and dare you to rebuild it yourself. To offend is not to insult. It is to challenge the sacred. Philosophy offends when it touches something. People hold dear identity, morality, belief, meaning. But if these things cannot survive challenge, they are not worth holding. A faith that crumbles under scrutiny is not faith, it's habit. A value that dissolves when questioned was never yours to begin with. The need for offense is greater now than ever. In an era of curated digital identities and algorithmic echo chambers, people are not exposed to contradiction. They are fed reinforcement. Offense is filtered out. Disagreement is labeled hate. The result is a population increasingly fragile in thought, addicted to affirmation, and hostile to discomfort. But growth requires offense. It requires someone to break the consensus, to say what no one else will, to force a confrontation between comfort and conscience. The philosopher must be willing to lose friends, to be misquoted, to be exiled. They must choose truth over applause. That is their function. To offend, not for ego, but for awakening. Philosophy that comforts the masses may sell books, but it does not change lives. The truth is abrasive. It burns before it heals. It tears before it builds. Philosophy must be willing to say what others will not. Otherwise, it is no longer philosophy. It is flattery in a clever disguise. Power shapes even what we believe to be natural, Foucauldian perspective. Michel Foucault dismantled the comfortable assumption that there is a clear boundary between what is natural and what is socially constructed. He argued that power is not just something exercised over people, it is something that shapes people. Power is not external, it is internalized. It defines what we see as normal, healthy, moral, and even real. And nowhere is this more insidious than in how we define what is natural. When something is labeled natural, it is shielded from critique. If a behavior, identity, or institution is said to be part of human nature, it becomes unquestionable. Patriarchy was once defended as natural. So was slavery. So were racial hierarchies and heterosexuality. These were not merely beliefs, they were institutional truths, backed by science, religion, and law. But what we now know is that these natural categories were constructed through discourse and enforced by power. Foucault's analysis of sexuality illustrates this clearly. Homosexuality was not always considered an identity, it was a behavior. It was only in the 19th century, with the rise of psychiatry and criminology, that the homosexual became a type of person. Institutions began to define sexuality medically, morally, and legally. Power produced the category, then acted as if it had always existed. It naturalized what it had invented. The same applies to mental illness. What counts as sanity is shaped by systems of classification that change over time. What was once mystical experience is now called psychosis. What was once rebellion is now oppositional defiance disorder. These are not pure medical facts, they are reflections of societal norms. Power decides what is natural, and once the label is applied, individuals are judged, managed, and often punished according to it. Even the body itself is not neutral. Medical science claims to describe it objectively, but its interpretations are shaped by cultural assumptions. Male and female, for example, are biological categories, but the meanings attached to them, strength, weakness, logic, emotionaire, political. Power inscribes meaning onto flesh. It tells you what a real man or natural woman is, and then disciplines your behavior to fit the mold. Education, religion, media, and science all participate in this process. They produce knowledge, and through that knowledge, they shape what is seen as self-evident. The more embedded the knowledge, the harder it is to question. You don't even see it as power, you see it as nature. That's the genius of power. It hides in plain sight. To say something is natural is to close the door on its critique. But what Foucault taught is that behind every so-called truth lies a struggle. A decision was made. A narrative was chosen. And often, that choice served someone's interest. Nothing escapes the reach of power, not even our most basic ideas about ourselves. To understand this is to begin the work of unmaking the natural, to see not just what is, but how it came to be. Man would rather cling to suffering than face meaninglessness. Schopenhauerian, existentialist perspective. Faced with the choice between prolonged suffering and the abyss of meaninglessness, man almost always chooses suffering. Not because he enjoys it, but because it at least feels like something. Pain confirms existence. Pain has shape. It can be named, narrated, endured, even dramatized. Meaninglessness, on the other hand, is a void. It offers no foothold. It denies identity, structure, and even complaint. In the face of this void, many would rather hurt than be lost. Arthur Schopenhauer believed that suffering is the essence of life because of the endless striving of the will-blind, insatiable force that drives all beings to want, chase, and inevitably suffer. But Schopenhauer also recognized something deeper. Humans cling to suffering because it gives them an anchor in a world that otherwise lacks inherent purpose. Pain is unpleasant, but it is real. It affirms that there is something to resist, to endure, to overcome. This is why people remain in toxic relationships, dead-end jobs, and existential routines that destroy them slowly. They suffer, complain, repeat, and they stay. The alternative is worse. The silence that follows when suffering is removed. Without conflict or craving, many confront an unbearable question: what now? Without pain, they must create meaning from nothing, and most people are not trained or willing to do that. Friedrich Nietzsche observed the same tendency in his critique of religion and morality. He noted that people hold on to guilt, fear, and resentment because these emotions offer psychological scaffolding. They justify existence. A man who believes he is suffering for a reason, for a God, a higher justice, a cosmic plan can bear anything. But remove that reason, and the suffering becomes naked. It loses narrative. It becomes absurd. And absurdity, to most, is more terrifying than agony. Existentialist thinkers like Camus and Sartre understood this dilemma. They saw that the human condition is defined not just by suffering, but by the need to assign it meaning. When faced with an indifferent universe, many invent stories, religions, ideologies. Cousteau explained their pain. They prefer being victims of fate to being creatures adrift in chaos. Even nihilism, when turned into an identity, becomes a kind of comfort. At least it's something. To accept that life has no inherent meaning, and that suffering is not redemptive but merely there requires a psychological leap that few can make. It demands the creation of values from scratch, without divine permission or societal consensus. It demands standing alone, without a script. Most people would rather bleed in a familiar room than stand in that unfamiliar silence. So man clings to suffering. He romanticizes it. He builds identities from it. He bonds with others through shared pain. He wears it like armor, not because it protects, but because it distracts from the terror of emptiness. Suffering, in this context, is not just a curse, it is a strategy, a way to avoid the void. The question, then, is not why people suffer. It is why they are so afraid to stop. Every institution exists to protect itself, not you. Foucauldian, cynical institutional critique. Institutions are not altruistic entities. They are not built to serve truth, justice, or compassion. They are built to survive. Whether it's a government, a corporation, a religious body, a school, or a media outreach, each institution prioritizes its own continuity above all else. The language may be noble, but the behavior is self-preserving. Institutions are machines, and like any machine, their first concern is not whom they serve, but how they can keep running. Michel Foucault showed that institutions don't just control people, they produce them. Schools don't just educate, They shape what knowledge is acceptable and what behavior is normal. Prisons don't just punish, they define what counts as criminal. Hospitals don't just heal, they decide what counts as illness. These institutions are not passive, they are active creators of reality. And once created, they defend that reality ferociously. Bureaucracies, hierarchies, policies, these are not neutral structures. They are designed to filter risk, maintain image, and control narratives. When a scandal arises in a university, the institution does not prioritize the victim, it prioritizes its reputation. When a corporation is exposed for unethical behavior, it does not act out of remorse, it acts out of necessity to protect the brand. Even when they apologize, the institution is calculating. The apology is not for you, it is for the optics. This instinct for self-preservation becomes more obvious during crises. Governments rewrite laws to shield themselves. Religious institutions cover up abuse. Media companies deflect criticism by rebranding. The moment public trust threatens internal stability, the institution's true face emerges. Cold, strategic, indifferent. It will sacrifice truth, individuals, even principles to maintain control. This is not corruption, it is design. Employees within institutions are taught to believe in the mission, but behind closed doors, they are evaluated on performance metrics, loyalty, and obedience. Whistleblowers are punished. Innovators are sidelined. Compliance is rewarded. The institution may speak of progress, but it dreads unpredictability. It prefers stability over integrity, order over truth. Even activism gets institutionalized. Movements that begin in fire are absorbed into paperwork. NGOs, committees, diversity initiatives, they sound like progress, but often function as pressure release valves. They give the illusion of reform while keeping the core structure untouched. This is how power sustains itself, by co-opting its critics, offering symbolic concessions, and absorbing dissent into bureaucracy. Foucault warned that power doesn't need to be malevolent, it just needs to be efficient. Once an institution learns how to preserve itself, it no longer cares about the ideals it was built upon. It becomes a creature with one purpose: continuation. And it will rewrite history, manipulate data, suppress voices, and weaponize morality to ensure that continuation. Institutions do not die easily. They outlive their founders, betray their missions, and adapt to new moral climates, not because they evolve ethically, but because survival demands it. The institution serves itself. It always has. And those who forget this are the easiest to betray. Most love is possession disguised as devotion. Schopenhauerian, psychoanalytic perspective. What most people call love is not unconditional, nor is it purely selfless. It is often a sophisticated form of possession and emotional contract cloaked in the language of care. It says, "I love you," but often means, "you're mine." Devotion becomes a transaction. Affection becomes a leash. The ideal of love is mutual recognition, as the union of two free individuals is rarely realized. Instead, love becomes control with a gentle face. Arthur Schopenhauer was deeply skeptical of romantic love. To him, it was a mechanism of the Willa biological trick played by nature to ensure reproduction. We believe we choose our partners, but we are driven by unconscious imperatives: symmetry, health, reproductive potential. What we call falling in love is often a species-level strategy to continue itself. It feels personal, but it is impersonal. You are not in love, you are being used. But even beyond biology, love tends to become possession. From early childhood, people are taught that love means attachment, that commitment requires exclusivity, and that desire must be owned. We do not learn how to admire. From a distance, we learn how to claim. We are not trained in freedom, we are trained in fusion. And in this fusion, the fear of loss is constant. Jealousy is not an aberration, it is built in. Psychoanalysis echoes this. Most love is conditional. We love those who meet our needs, validate our identities, soothe our insecurities. We say we want them to be happy, but only if that happiness includes us. We say we want the best for them, but we often resent their growth if it moves them away. We seek partners who reflect back the version of ourselves we want to see. When they stop mirroring that, we say, the love is gone. But what is lost is not love, it is control. Even acts of devotion can carry the residue of possession. Sacrifices are made, but often with silent expectation. Affection is given, but often to bind. Attention is lavished, but to maintain emotional dominance. We rarely love people for who they are. We love them for how they make us feel. And when they stop making us feel that way, we withhold, we punish, we retreat. True love that is not possession, requires letting go. It requires radical respect for the other's autonomy. It means loving someone even when they do not need you, even when they change, even when they leave. It is rare because it is painful. It demands ego death. And most are not willing to love without ownership. So, they possess. Gently, lovingly, with flowers, rituals, and promises. But underneath the devotion is a fear. That love without control is too unstable, too uncertain, too risky. So we rebrand possession as passion. We normalize jealousy. We call boundaries insecurities. And we continue to claim each other in the name of love. Progress is a myth told by tyrants in suits. Neo-Marxist, postmodernist critique. Progress is the secular religion of modernity. It promises that tomorrow will always be better than today, that technology equals enlightenment, and that history bends inevitably toward justice. But this narrative is not neutral, it is political. It serves those in power. The myth of progress is told not to liberate, but to pacify. And the storytellers are not prophets, they are tyrants in suits. Under the guise of innovation, institutions consolidate control. Governments pass surveillance laws in the name of security. Corporations track your every move in the name of personalization. Work becomes flexible, which really means never-ending. Technology improves, but life becomes more fragmented, more exhausting, more alienated. We are told we are advancing, yet depression, anxiety, and loneliness have become epidemics. This is not evolution, it is engineered dependency dressed in optimism. The myth of progress is useful because it justifies the present. If everything is improving, then current injustices are temporary, unfortunate side effects on the way to utopia. Poverty becomes a data point. Environmental destruction becomes the cost of development. Inequality is reframed as a phase, something to be corrected once growth is optimized. The powerful delay justice indefinitely, always promising it is just one innovation away. The idea of linear progress also flattens history. It rewrites colonialism as modernization. It reframes cultural erasure as global integration. It forgets that every leap in power steam engines, atomic bombs, algorithm has been a double-edged sword. Progress gives us antibiotics, but also biological weapons. It gives us the internet, but also a permanent state of digital surveillance. It gives us democracy, but in the same breath, media empires that manufacture consent. Tyrants in suits don't need violence, they have metrics. They don't need censorship, they have narratives. We're making progress, they say, when asked about inequality, corruption, climate change. The myth deflects accountability. It allows CEOs to preach sustainability while destroying ecosystems. It lets politicians tout justice while funding war. The story is not designed to be questioned, it is designed to be believed. Progress becomes a shield against revolt. When people suffer, they are told to wait. When they protest, they are told they're standing in the way of development. When they demand change, they are told that it's already happening. The myth replaces action with patience, anger with hope, and dissent with data. This doesn't mean all change is false, but it means progress must be decoupled from propaganda. It must be judged not by promises, but by outcomes. Who benefits? Who pays? Who decides what counts as progress? Until we ask those questions, progress remains a fable told by tyrants in boardrooms selling the illusion of a better world while extracting everything from the one we already have. Weak men seek rules. Strong men seek meaning. Nietzschean and existentialist lens. Rules are easy. They tell you what to do, what to avoid, how to behave. They offer structure, predictability, and reward. But they also offer an escape from responsibility, from thought, from freedom. Weak men love rules not because they are moral, but because they are afraid. Afraid of uncertainty, afraid of failure, afraid of standing alone without a script. Strong men, by contrast, do not need rules. They seek meaning. They forge values. They risk themselves in the unknown. Rules provide safety. They offer the illusion of order in a chaotic world. They promise that if you follow them, you will be good, accepted, protected. But this bargain is costly. You trade autonomy for approval. You trade discovery for obedience. You may never make a mistake, but you will also never truly live. Nietzsche warned against this moral herd. He saw that most people would rather be told what is right than find out for themselves. They fear the responsibility of choice. So they follow religious commandments, social etiquette, political slogans. They mimic others' lives. They outsource their conscience. This is not virtue, it is cowardice disguised as discipline. The weak man needs rules because he has no internal compass. He fears his own instincts. He suppresses his will to avoid standing out. He measures success by compliance. He confuses guilt with growth. He praises humility because he's terrified of ambition. And he judges the strong not because they are wrong, but because they are free. The strong man is different. He does not reject all rules, but he knows where they come from. He does not blindly obey, he interrogates, reshapes, and transcends. He is not interested in being good. He is interested in being true. He does not live to meet expectation. She lives to embody meaning, even if that meaning isolates him. To seek meaning is to enter dangerous territory. It means facing the absurdity of existence, the lack of objective morality, the burden of freedom. It means crafting a code out of experience, not inheritance. It means suffering without guarantee, sacrificing without reward. This is not comfortable, but it is real. Weak men fear suffering because they see no purpose in it. Strong men embrace suffering because they are shaping something with it. Weak men seek applause. Strong men seek truth. The weak follow to avoid blame. The strong lead, even if they fail. This philosophy does not glorify cruelty. It does not excuse recklessness. But it demands integrity. It demands that a man stand on his own meaning, not hide in the shadows of inherited rules. Rules will make you acceptable. Meaning will make you dangerous. The world has enough obedience. What it lacks is courage. Sexual repression is political repression. Foucauldian and radical psychoanalytic perspective. Sexuality is not just biological, it is political. How a society regulates sex reveals how it controls its people. Michel Foucault argued that repression of sexuality is never simply moral. It is strategic. It disciplines bodies, polices identities, and reinforces power structures. To control sex is to control life, at its most instinctual, most intimate, and most explosive. Sexual repression is not privatate, is public order disguised as personal virtue. Societies have long understood this. Religions built entire doctrines around sexual abstinence. Governments defined morality through laws against perversion. Families enforced shame through silence and punishment. The goal was not purity, it was conformity. A repressed sexuality is easier to manage. A desiring body is unpredictable. A shamed body is obedient. Foucault traced the shift from silence to discourse. In the past, sex was taboo. In modernity, it is talked about endlessly, but in managed, medicalized, marketable ways. This isn't liberation, it's regulation. The more sex is named, studied, categorized, the more it is controlled. You're not just sexual. You are labeled straight, gay, bi, asexual, deviant, healthy, hypersexual. These categories are not neutral, they are institutional tools. The repression also targets pleasure itself. Especially for women, queerness, or anyone outside the normative matrix, pleasure is framed as dangerous. It is pathologized, commodified, or erased. The right to enjoy one's body becomes a battleground. Who gets to feel? Who gets to be desired? Who gets to name their desire without punishment? These are not biological questions, they are political. Sexual repression also maintains economic hierarchies. A docile workforce is a repressed one. Sexual energy, when denied, is redirected into consumption, labor, or aggression. Advertising sells sex, but society fears its liberation. Porn is everywhere, but real discussions about desire, consent, or bodily autonomy remain taboo. This paradox is not accidental, it sustains power. It creates dependency. It feeds shame, and shame breeds control. Even movements that claim to liberate sex often reinforce repression in disguise. Sex positivity, if commodified, becomes another form of performance. Liberation becomes a brand. Orgasm becomes a benchmark. Desire becomes a checklist. Freedom becomes another standard to meet. The body is still not free, is just differently managed. True sexual liberation is not about promiscuity, it is about sovereignty. It is about reclaiming the body from systems that use it as a tool, a symbol, or a threat. It is about saying no without guilt and yes without shame. It is about refusing to let institutions decide what intimacy looks like, who it is for, and what forms it must take. To repress sex is to repress the self. And to liberate sexuality is to liberate the body, the psyche, and the will. This is why power fears it. Because a people who own their desires are a people who cannot be quietly ruled. History is written by those who won the power to lie. Foucauldian and post-structuralist critique. History is not a neutral recounting of past events. It is a selective narrative curated by those who gained and maintained power. The phrase, "history is written by the victors," is too gentle. It suggests bias without deception. But the truth is sharper. History is written by those who won the power to lie convincingly, authoritatively, and permanently. Power does not simply destroy its enemies, it erases them. It erases nuance, context, and contradiction. Empires don't record the atrocities they committed, they record the civilization they brought. Colonizers don't preserve the voices of the conquered, they write tales of exploration and salvation. When a regime wins, it gains not just land or gold, it gains narrative control. It rewrites the past to justify its present. Michel Foucault revealed that history is not just told, it is produced. It is shaped by institutions, schools, libraries, media, churches, museums. These are not passive archives. They are machines of memory, engineered to preserve certain truths and discard others. What we call official history is not a record, it is a verdict. It is the outcome of a war, not just for territory, but for meaning. Every monument is a decision. Every textbook is a filter. Every curriculum is an act of power. Ask yourself, whose story is missing? Whose perspective was never recorded? Who was labeled a rebel, a heretic, a savage, a terrorist, when they were simply resisting domination? These questions do not merely expose flaws in the historical record. They expose the purpose behind the record, to legitimize existing hierarchies. Even facts, when selected and arranged, become tools of ideology. Two wars may involve the same number of deaths, the same violence, the same moral complexity. But one will be remembered as liberation, the other as invasion, depending on who tells the story. Memory is weaponized, erasure is strategic. Technology has only made this worse. Data is stored by platforms owned by corporations. Algorithms decide which history you see, which voices are amplified, which narratives become trends. Revisionism is no longer just academic, it is viral. Truth competes with spin. The past is not just forgotten, it is actively overwritten. This does not mean history is worthless, but it must be read as a map of power. Every empire left its story behind, inscribed in stone, etched in archives, printed in books. But those stories must be read with suspicion, with resistance, because often the truth is not what's recorded, it's what's missing. To understand history is to see not just what happened, but who had the authority to say what happened and who paid the price for that version becoming truth. Life is not a gift, it's a sentence. Schopenhauerian and absurdist philosophy. Life is commonly described as a gift, precious, sacred, bestowed. But this language hides a brutal reality. For many thinkers, especially Arthur Schopenhauer and the absurdists, life is not a gift, it is a sentence. We are thrown into existence without consent, born into a body we did not choose, bound to a world ruled by pain, desire, decay, and death. There is no escape, there is no justification, there is only endurance. Schopenhauer believed that the driving force behind existence is the willing, unconscious, blind impulse that keeps everything striving, desiring, chasing. This will is never satisfied. Every fulfilled desire births a new one. Pleasure is fleeting, peace is rare. Even in moments of joy, we are haunted by the knowledge that it will end. Thus, life becomes a punishment not for something we did but for simply being. Existence is not a celebration, it is a compulsion. We wake, we work, we age, we die. Most of life is not chosen, it is inherited. Biological impulses control us. Social structures bind us. Economic systems exploit us, and yet we are told to be grateful. To call this existence a gift is to mock those whose lives are filled with suffering, poverty, isolation, or chronic pain. What kind of gift destroys you slowly while demanding your gratitude? Even religion, which tries to frame life as purposeful, often turns it into a probation. Life becomes a test, a trial, a path to another world. But what kind of gift is it that must be escaped or transcended? What kind of loving creator burdens its creation with unending struggle as a prerequisite for love? The absurdists like Camus and Cioran understood this horror. They saw life as a cosmic Jokino script, no meaning, just a sentient animal trying to find sense in chaos. Camus asked, "If life is absurd, why not end it?" His answer was rebellion. Not suicide, but defiance. If life is a sentence, then let us serve it with dignity, without illusion. Let us stare into the void and still choose to walk. This defiance, however, does not erase the sentence, it simply transforms it into a conscious act. To live with eyes open is to carry the full weight of the absurd. It is to know that existence has no why, no final reward, no intrinsic value, and to live anyway. Not because life is sacred, but because it is the only stage we have. Those who speak of life as a gift often do so from comfort. But for the majority, life is struggle with brief interludes of peace. It is not a present wrapped in joy, it is a debt that begins at birth and ends with death. And still, we go on. Not because we must love life, but because we are sentenced to live it. And until the sentence ends, we write meaning with borrowed ink, on paper that burns. To follow society is to betray yourself. Nietzschean and existentialist perspective. Society does not want you to be yourself. It wants you to be useful. From the moment you are born, you are told who to be. Polite, productive, predictable. Your dreams are shaped by advertising. Your fears are implanted by institutions. Your morality is inherited, not examined. If you follow society without question, you are not living, you are being lived. You have betrayed yourself, not by accident, but by design. Friedrich Nietzsche argued that most people do not live authentically. They inherit values like hand-me-down clothes, never asking who made them or why. They obey because it is easier than thinking. They fit in because standing out is dangerous. Society rewards conformity and punishes dissent not with violence, always, but with isolation, ridicule, and guilt. The betrayal begins early. Children are praised for obedience, not originality. Schools teach compliance, not wisdom. Individuality is celebrated only when it fits within a marketable template. You are free to be yourself, as long as yourself can be monetized, managed, or muted. To truly be yourself, you must be willing to disappoint others. You must risk exile from the tribe. The path of authenticity is narrow, not because it's hidden, but because it's lonely. The moment you say, "This is who I am," society responds, "Here's who you should be." To follow that voice is to betray the one inside you. Existentialists like Kierkegaard and Sartre emphasize the burden of freedom. To choose yourself, you must reject the roles assigned to you. You must define your own meaning. This is terrifying. It is easier to live by scripts, career, marriage, faith, consumption, than to write your own. But every script followed uncritically is a betrayal. It is saying, "I prefer safety over truth." The cost of self-betrayal is subtle but devastating. You feel it in the quiet resentment of a life that isn't yours. You feel it in the bitterness that follows success you didn't choose. You feel it when you are surrounded by people but remain unseen. You played the game, you won, and now you realize you lost yourself in the process. To follow society is to shrink, to perform instead of exist, to fit in instead of stand firm. True freedom is not granted, it is claimed. And claiming it means refusing the comfort of belonging in exchange for the clarity of being. Authenticity is not easy. It will cost you approval, maybe even love. But the alternative is a life lived as a shadow, a self shaped by mirrors, a voice that never spoke its own name. To betray yourself is to live for others without ever living for yourself. To reject that betrayal is to begin finally to live. We are punished for pleasure and rewarded for obedience. Foucauldian and post-structuralist critique. Pleasure threatens control. It is spontaneous, personal, embodied, and often unpredictable. Obedience, by contrast, is safe, measurable, and easily governed. That's why, in most societies, pleasure is stigmatized or regulated, while obedience is rewarded. You are told to delay gratification, suppress desire, follow rules, and strive for approval not because it's moral, but because it's manageable. From religion to corporate culture, institutions have always feared the ungovernable nature of pleasure. So, they punish it in form, in principle, and in practice. Michel Foucault argued that power doesn't merely restrict behavior, it shapes it. It defines what's normal, healthy, good. Pleasure, particularly bodily pleasure, disrupts those categories. It resists being timed, taxed, or tamed. A person who takes joy in their body, their sexuality, their creativity without shame is harder to control. They don't need external validation. They don't respond to guilt. They don't conform. That's why pleasure, especially when it steps outside institutional boundaries, is moralized. Sex, outside marriage, is sin. Drug-induced euphoria is deviance. Expressive dancing becomes indecent. Queer pleasure becomes perversion. Even leisure, if not commodified, is laziness. The common thread is this: pleasure without permission is dangerous. So the system teaches that pleasure must be earned, regulated, or hidden. Meanwhile, obedience is sanctified. The child who follows rules gets the gold star. The worker who never questions gets promoted. The citizen who never protests is labeled patriotic. Submission is repackaged as virtue. The obedient are labeled disciplined, reliable, respectable. They're rewarded not because they're wise, but because they don't disrupt. This conditioning starts early. In school, children are penalized for daydreaming, rewarded for sitting still. In religion, believers are told to deny themselves earthly joys for heavenly approval. In the workplace, Employees are incentivized to sacrifice time, health, and even truth in the name of productivity. Systems thrive when individuals ignore their own impulses in favor of compliance. Pleasure becomes privatized, marketed, and taxed. It's sold back to people in forms that can be tracked: gym memberships, curated vacations, Instagrammable brunches. These are not threats. They're predictable, consumer-safe versions of joy. But raw, uncommodified pleasure, laughter that isn't packaged, sex that isn't moralized, rest that isn't earned, still seen as suspect. Punishment doesn't always mean prison or hell. It's subtler. Social shame, internal guilt, withdrawal of affection, exclusion from legitimacy. The person who chooses pleasure over obedience is labeled irresponsible. The artist who values passion over routine is called immature. The free spirit is called naive. These aren't insults, they're tools of social correction. To reclaim pleasure is a radical act, not because it's indulgent, but because it's defiant. It says, "My body is mine, my time is mine. My joy does not need to be justified." Obedience may grant safety, but pleasure grants sovereignty. And that's what power fears most. The masses are spiritually lazy. Nietzschean and existentialist critique. Most people don't want truth. They want comfort. They don't seek meaning, they borrow it. They don't question the morality they live by, the systems they serve, or the identities they wear. This is not ignorance, it is laziness. Spiritual laziness. A quiet, unconscious refusal to confront the burden of existence. And society is structured to encourage exactly that. Friedrich Nietzsche saw it clearly. The average person, he argued, is content to live a borrowed life. They follow religious rules, cultural rituals, and moral platitudes not because they believe in them, but because they require no effort. It's easier to accept a handed-down worldview than to build your own. It's easier to kneel than to stand alone. To live spiritually awake requires facing uncomfortable truths, that life has no inherent meaning, that morality is fluid, that suffering is inevitable. These truths demand thought, strength, and confrontation with oneself. But most people would rather distract themselves with entertainment, with work, with gossip, with mindless consumption. They numb the spiritual hunger rather than feed it. Organized religion thrives on this laziness. It provides ready-made answers, rigid codes, and external authorities. It promises salvation in exchange for submission. You don't have to wrestle with metaphysical questions, you just have to believe. Obedience replaces understanding. Ritual replaces reflection. The same can be said for ideological movements. People don't want complexity, they want slogans. Even spirituality, in its modern, commodified form, has become lazy. Mindfulness apps, motivational quotes, law of attraction mantras. These aren't spiritual tools, they're pacifiers. They soothe the anxiety of existence without confronting its core. They turn transformation into lifestyle branding. The soul becomes another product. True spiritual effort requires solitude, risk, and responsibility. It means looking at yourself without illusion. It means rejecting consensus. It means asking questions that have no guaranteed answers. And it means accepting that no one will save you, not gods, not ideologies, not institutions. Existentialists like Sartre argued that we are condemned to be free. That's not liberation, it's a sentence. It means we must choose our essence in a world that offers no script. But freedom is frightening. It demands that we live without excuses. The spiritually lazy reject this. They prefer roles: worker, patriot, believer, consumer. These roles come with instructions. They feel like identity, but they're camouflage. The masses aren't stupid, they're afraid. And fear breeds laziness, the fear of being wrong, the fear of standing out, the fear of facing the vast, chaotic void of existence and realizing you are completely responsible for what you do with it. Spiritual laziness is not benign. It fuels authoritarianism. It breeds dogma. It turns people into tools for systems they never chose. And it punishes those who wake up. The world doesn't need more believers, it needs more thinkers, more seekers, more individuals willing to take the terrifying step into a life of meaning forged by their own hands. Truth is a battlefield, not a destination. Foucauldian and post-truth philosophy. Truth is not discovered, it is fought over. It is not a final resting place, it is a contested zone, filled with competing narratives, shifting power dynamics, and ideological weapons. The belief that truth is pure, neutral, or eternal is itself a political fantasy. What we call truth is often the temporary victory of one perspective over others. It is a battlefield, not a destination. Michel Foucault showed that every era has its own regime of truth, a system that determines what can be said, who can speak, and what counts as evidence. These regimes are not born from objective enlightenment. They are crafted by institutions, schools, courts, media, science, religion. Each claims legitimacy, each silences dissent. The dominant truth becomes invisible, not because it is self-evident, but because it is enforced. History offers endless examples. Galileo's truth was heresy. Civil rights activists were once radicals. Colonialism was taught as progress. Whose truth wins is not a function of accuracy, it's a function of power. And when power shifts, so does truth. This doesn't mean truth is meaningless. It means it's political. It is not founded, is defended. In the age of mass media and digital information, truth becomes even more volatile. Algorithms curate realities. News channels sell narratives. Facts are chosen, framed, and repeated until they become common sense. But consensus is not truth, it is the echo of dominance. We do not live in an age of lies. We live in an age of weaponized truth. Science is no longer immune. It is shaped by funding, ideology, and institutional agendas. What gets studied, published, and promoted reflects not just inquiry, but influence. Even language betrays bias. Think of terms like collateral damage, enhanced interrogation, or disinformation. These are not descriptions, they are rhetorical weapons. The battle for truth is fought not only in facts, but in framing. Control the narrative, and you don't need to lie, you simply redirect attention. Flood the zone with noise. Redefine the terms. Attack the source. Truth becomes a casualty, not through distortion, but through overload. This is why truth must be fought for. Not assumed, not inherited fought. It means interrogating sources, questioning motives, and accepting that clarity is rare. It means standing your ground in a storm of contradiction. It means losing allies, offending sensibilities, and confronting uncertainty without retreat. Truth is not a temple, it is a trench, and those who dare to occupy it must be willing to bleed. Being normal is a form of submission. Nietzschean and Foucauldian synthesis. To be normal is not to be free, is to obey without question. Normality is not a neutral state. It is a construct designed by culture, enforced by institutions, and internalized by individuals. It dictates how one should speak, dress, think, feel, love, and live. It is presented as safety and stability, but in truth, it is control, subtle, invisible, and totalizing. To be normal is to consent to the script written by others, often without even realizing it. Friedrich Nietzsche recognized the tyranny of the normal. He warned against the herd mentality, where the average is not only accepted but worshipped. In such a world, deviation is treated as sickness, and conformity is labeled virtue. The herd does not tolerate difference, it pathologizes it. Genius is madness. Passion is dysfunction. Freedom is rebellion. The exceptional are isolated, not because they are wrong, but because they make the herd uncomfortable. Michel Foucault added another layer. Normality is not just social, it is institutional. Schools grade behavior. Clinics diagnose deviance. Workplaces enforce dress codes. Religions demand purity. Each system has its own metrics of normal, and those who fall outside the range are corrected or cast out. These norms are enforced not with chains, but with shame. People censor themselves long before others intervene. Normality operates through fear, the fear of standing out, the fear of being judged, the fear of being alone. This fear is so powerful that people willingly erase themselves to avoid it. They laugh at jokes they don't find funny. They pursue careers they don't believe in. They enter relationships they don't want, all in the name of being normal. The tragedy is that most people believe they are making choices. But if every choice aligns with expectation, it's not autonomy, it's submission. They believe they are individuals, but they are templates. The normal person is not living, they are functioning. They are executing a culturally approved algorithm. Go to school, get a job, marry, consume, obey, die. To reject normality is not to be antisocial, it is to be awake. It is to ask, why must I fit? It is to risk exclusion in exchange for authenticity. But few take that risk. It is easier to blend in than to stand alone. The normal are praised because they are predictable. The abnormal are feared because they are free. Society needs normal people. They keep the machine running. They buy, vote, reproduce, comply. But the machine does not serve them, it uses them. And the more they strive to be normal, the further they drift from themselves. Being normal is not harmless. It is the quiet death of the soul, the erosion of authenticity, the slow, smiling betrayal of the self. Desire is an endless hunger that mocks fulfillment. Schopenhauerian and psychoanalytic view. Desire is not a path to happiness, it is a loop of torment. Every fulfilled desire gives birth to a new one. Satisfaction is a mirage, visible, alluring, but always receding. The moment you grasp it, it vanishes. Arthur Schopenhauer called this the agony of the will-a-blind, insatiable force that drives all beings to crave, to chase, to suffer. The will does not rest, it does not reason. It wants for no reason other than to want. It inhabits us through biology, instinct, and emotion. We want food, sex, love, status, peace, but none of these ever truly satisfy. They merely dull the ache until the next hunger arises. Even when we get what we want, we are left with the dread of losing it, the boredom of having it, or the desire for more. Desire is the architecture of suffering. Schopenhauer observed that the happiest moments in life are not when we are wanting, but when we are free from want, those rare moments of stillness, contemplation, or aesthetic experience. Yet those are fleeting. The will always returns. The cycle renews. Even Freud saw this torment. The libido, the drive toward pleasure, constantly clashes with reality. We repress, redirect, sublimate. Civilization demands it. We are taught to delay gratification, to behave, to suppress our raw instincts. But they do not disappear, they mutate. Desire leaks out in neurosis, addiction, obsession. It laughs at restraint. Consumer culture exploits this perfectly. It weaponizes desire. Every product promises fulfillment. Every advertisement stokes dissatisfaction, but nothing satisfies for long. The car, the house, the body, the career, they are never enough, because they were never meant to be. Capitalism thrives on unfulfilled desire. The engine of the market is your emptiness. Even in love, desire mocks us. We idealize, we pursue, we project fantasies onto others. We confuse possession with passion, lust with intimacy. And when the illusion shatters, we either move on to a new fantasy or cling to the ruins. What we desire is not the other person but how they make us feel. When they no longer reflect that, desire fades or turns to resentment. Desire is endless because it is existential. It is the symptom of a deeper void, the absence of meaning in a meaningless universe. We think desire is about objects, but it is about identity. We desire to feel alive, to feel significant, But no object, no person, no achievement can give us that permanently. The only escape Schopenhauer saw was negation of the will, asceticism, detachment, art, contemplation. Not because they bring joy, but because they silence desire if only briefly. Desire whispers promises it never keeps. It is not a path, it is a trap. And the more we chase it, the more it laughs. Most people are only free in their delusions. Existentialist and Foucauldian critique. Freedom is a word repeated so often it has become meaningless. People believe they are free because they vote, consume, choose jobs, and curate their identities. But most of this freedom is illusory. It is freedom within a cage, choice within a script. The truth is brutal. Most people are only free in their delusions. They mistake conformity for autonomy. They confuse permission with liberation. Existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir insisted that freedom is not simply the ability to choose, it is the responsibility to create meaning in an absurd world. That kind of freedom is terrifying. It requires rejecting prepackaged values, risking alienation, and confronting the void without flinching. Very few are willing to do that. So they build lives around distraction, obedience, and carefully managed self-deception. Michel Foucault revealed that institutions engineer the very fabric of what we believe is freedom. Schools teach you what knowledge counts. Medicine tells you what health looks like. Media frames what's real and what's not. You're not free. You're conditioned. You believe you're deciding, but your choices are pre-filtered by algorithms, economics, and cultural programming. Freedom has become aestheticized. People think freedom is choosing what to wear, what to post, who to date. But these are cosmetic freedoms. They keep the deeper structures intact. You can dye your hair blue, but if you question corporate capitalism, you're radicalized. You can change your pronouns, but if you critique the system, you're dangerous. The system doesn't care what you look like as long as you remain useful. People declare themselves free as they drown in debt, burn out in jobs they hate, and parrot ideologies they didn't examine. Their freedom is the freedom to comply, to choose between Pepsi and Coke, between political parties that serve the same machine. They call it democracy, but it's branding. Even rebellion becomes co-opted. Tattoos, piercings, activism, identity politics, all absorbed, packaged, and sold back as lifestyle. You're allowed to be different as long as it's marketable. As long as it doesn't threaten power. This is not freedom. It's curated deviance. True freedom is terrifying because it strips away excuses. It forces you to confront your own cowardice. It means asking, who am I if I stop performing? What do I want when no one is watching? What do I believe that doesn't come from fear or approval? Most can't face those questions. So they retreat into delusion. They convince themselves they are free because the truth would shatter them. They are caged, but the bars are painted like windows. To be free is not to do what you want. It is to know why you want it. It is to live without illusion, even if that means living alone.